What's up, heathens? How y'all doing? Tonight we have a discussion between Dr. Richard Carrier and Dr. Aaron Adair, and we're going to be discussing a lot of topics. Just kind of going through the list here to let y'all know kind of what to expect. We're going to be talking about Philo and his archangel, the ascension of Isaiah, Norelli, and Dr. Litwa. And then we're going to kind of have just sort of a casual discussion on how to have better discussions on these topics, because lately it's been getting a little bit out of hand. And then we're going to discuss some common mistakes that scholars make when discussing historicity. And then we're going to be talking about kind of the future of mythicism, where we can go, from the mythicist topic on into, I guess, deeper discussions on the history of Christianity, or however we want to go about that. We'll be talking about that mainly from Aaron's SBL topic. So that's kind of what we have in store tonight. I just want to say thank you to both of you guys for making time in your schedule. I know that both of you all are very busy. I mean, I caught Aaron on a day when he had a Myth Vision interview as well. So he's been, on camera for a while today. So just thank you both for being able to be here.
It's good to be here. I'm glad to be invited.
Yeah, glad to be here as well. And I have to say, I love Aaron's backdrop. Like, first of all, it's beautifully stitched. Secondly, well chosen.
It's basically, this is the only technology that we could develop to prove one way or another whether mythicism is true.
Is that your mythicist lab back there? Is that what that is?
It's basically the circa 1983 set of the TARDIS from Doctor Who.
That's right. Yeah, yeah. A Tom Baker episode, probably.
Yeah, either Tom Baker or Peter Davison is right on the cusp there, I think.
Yeah, Tom Baker's the one everybody says I look like.
Oh.
I kind of see it.
It's the wild hair, yeah.
Yeah. I was about to go into too much Doctor Who trivia. Probably better we go to a different topic.
Yeah. No, I love it. But yeah, okay. So yeah, John, you've got a good itinerary today. So
right. Yeah, definitely. Okay. Yeah, right. So to get this started, to kick things off on a very Carrier versus Adair kind of platform. Now, Aaron, you kind of want to be a little critical about how Dr. Carrier presents, this archangel in Philo, and the whole kind of topic around that. So, do you want to start off by kind of introducing us to your thoughts on that topic in general?
Yeah, I'll try to do my best there. But I probably note that this probably won't be so much a debate, because first off, Rich and I probably agree on a whole bunch. It's just going to be fine points of, seeing what's, holds up, and I'm just going around the car and kicking the tires to see if it's still holding up on everything. I should also note that Richard and I, we have some long history that I was actually a supporter earlier on for the On the History of Jesus project in the first place. I've been, using those ideas for my own sorts of research as a paradigm for exploring things. So wherever we disagree, it's probably going to be on nitty gritty rather than huge paradigmatic issues. So if you want a throwdown debate, either I'm going to need way more alcohol or we're going to need different guests. And unfortunately, all I have is Diet Coke. Okay, so the debate point, I guess if we want to call it that, is one of the things that has come up, especially in some recent drama, has been what is going on with the argument about Philo describing this magnificent archangel that seems to have a lot of features in the same category as we see Jesus as also some sort of angelic being, pre-existing, creator of the universe, high priest of the universe, etc. And we can easily cite chapter and verse in Philo and see that he says that. We can go chapter and verse in the New Testament, they say that about Jesus. To say they're not connected would be pretty hard to maintain. The thing that I guess has been causing the friction is, can we also pull from Philo evidence that this archangel had a name, and it wasn't Bingo? Was the name actually Jesus?
Right.
So the passage that is all the rage is coming from Zechariah 6, in particular in the Greek version, since that's the version that Philo is reading and citing from in particular. And the whole thing is that there's this one part from Zechariah 6, verse 13, if I remember correctly, that talks about the one who called rising, who will rise and basically, spread out and, in maybe more colloquial terms, kick butt and take names. I'm obviously not doing an exact quote of Zechariah, but
Right.
This is what Philo highlights. And the contention is, because this verse is also describing a character named Jesus as well, that Joshua, the high priest, and Joshua, the son of Jehozadak, which you could easily interpret as Jesus, the son of righteous Yahweh, righteous God. It's like, oh my goodness, I just found Jesus and it was in Philo the whole time. The contention is it really the case that Philo is actually citing this and we are to infer that from his stuff, or is it that when we read this in context, it doesn't follow? So the question is then, is this Joshua, Jesus, high priest, the same as in the Hebrew, it's supposed to be the branch, in the Greek version, it's the rising or the east? Are these the same character? But before I go into anything else, Richard, it's probably best that you make your case and that I kind of respond back and forth.
No, I think that's a good introduction. And I do think it's important to keep those two things apart that you did, because I find a lot of people don't keep these two things apart. So that Philo and Paul are talking about the same archangel is not disputable. What's arguable, what's debatable is what did Philo understand that angel to have the name Jesus already? And that's definitely, we can have arguments about that, because Philo doesn't explicitly say that, so you have to infer that from the text. But I find people that attack the very notion that they're talking about the same archangel. So apart from the name, right? So however Jesus got his name, the fact that we're looking at the Christians thought that their Jesus was this archangel become incarnate, I think that's the most important thing that people should not forget about all this. That's really the most important thing for mythicism, is that there was already this angel that they imagined existed. Now, the other question is where did he get its name? Was he named this by his mom? Or did he already have this name? Or did they think it was a name assigned cultically upon his resurrection, or things like this? So that's more of an open argument question. And it's also important to keep distinct that I don't think this is not evidence for mythicism either way. And so I think a lot of people get confused by this and thinking that I'm arguing that, well, therefore Jesus didn't exist. And so no, actually, this is totally compatible with historicity. It's entirely possible that Jesus was coincidentally also his name for real, or that they assigned him this name, even if he was a historical person, or he himself might have taken this name for this very reason, to claim that he's this incarnated angel, or his followers might have done that. So however we interpret Philo here, it's totally compatible with historicity. It doesn't do anything like that. But what it does do is it takes away an argument that, well, where would they have come up with this? And it's like, well, they already had these ideas floating around. And that's where they would come up with it. So then people latch onto this. Did he mean the character in Zechariah 6:13 named Jesus? Is that who he's talking about? And that's where we can have a specific debate about what is the evidence for that. And we can get into the details, but I think just the short of it is that the text as it was in the time of Philo was probably corrupt. I think there's good arguments that it might have gotten distorted over time, but it clearly got distorted before it got into Greek, because it's distorted in the Hebrew. So the Hebrew, there's only one person present. It's Jesus, and Zechariah is the one who's saying these things. So it can directly, straightforwardly be read as that the Anatole, the one who's going to rise, is going to be this Jesus character. No, it could also be that they're talking about somebody else who's not named in the verse. It could also be talking about somebody else who was once upon a time named in the verse. But we're going to deal with the text as Philo's looking at it, right? Because Philo's talking about what the text he's looking at. And the text he's looking at, it looks like he's talking about Jesus. Now that's one part of it. But the argument for that being the case is that why would he think that this verse talks about his archangel? Why does he think Anatole is his archangel? And he says the reason why, well, this is a perfect name for him. Anatole is a perfect name for this angel because he's the firstborn son of God, and he lists some attributes. And elsewhere in the book, same book, on the confusion of tongues, he lists more attributes for this archangel. And in other books, he talks about more attributes as well. But the first one he mentions is firstborn son of God. And we know also that he's a high priest of God's celestial temple. Philo talks about that as well. So here we have in this verse, Zechariah 6, verse 13, someone who's also the son of God and also the high priest, and that he's clearly interpreting as some sort of supernatural being, not a historical character. The original authors of Zechariah were clearly talking about real people. They weren't talking about angels. So Philo's seeing something here. What is he seeing? And I think there's two ways to look at this. Is it's coincidentally, just by sheer coincidence, there's a Jesus, son of God, high priest in this passage, but that's not the one that Philo thinks is appropriately named Anatole, because he's the firstborn son of God and the high priest. Or you can say that the reason he's finding this in here is that he sees Jesus, son of God, the high priest, and he's going, this is my son of God, the high priest, the archangel I'm talking about. So we have an explanatory hypothesis for why he would think that this Anatole is referring to his archangel. The alternative is that that's not what happened, and it's just a sheer, massive, improbable coincidence that there just happens to be the same son of God, high priest figure in that same verse. Then he's talking about a son of God, high priest figure, completely unrelated. And so that's basically the gist of my argument, why I come to the conclusion that I do. We can get into the nitty gritty from there.
Right. Yeah. And so basically, to make the argument that Philo is actually seeing the high priest Joshua character and the Anatole as the same character,
Right.
is then, is it the case in the Zechariah text? Are they the same, or are they distinguished? So first off, on background, the fact that, like I said, originally in the Hebrew, he's called the branch, and that term branch is usually referred to a Davidic regal figure, not someone of the priestly line. So a reader that would first think this should be relating to someone not of the priesthood, someone of a different genealogical background. So that would be like the first thought that one would have. But again, we want to go by content.
Right. We're getting to, when you're talking about there, we're getting to what the authors of Zechariah meant, right?
True.
That stuff's no longer in the text that Philo's looking at. And clearly he's seeing Anatole, not branched, right? So his argument is based on seeing Anatole there. Something triggered him, right? Anatole, who's being called Anatole here? So I think we do need to keep distinct. What did the original authors mean? Which I think is completely different. Is definitely completely different from what Philo is interpreting. And then getting to what is Philo seeing here? And then that's where we proceed from that. That's
fair. So if we though continue in the Zechariah passage, the branch or the Anatole, again in the Greek it's Anatole, it's talked about more and more, and it says that person will sit on the throne, and then it's saying in the next verse as well, and that Anatole will also have a priest by his side. So that would suggest that the priest figure and the Anatole figure are two different entities.
Yeah, we're looking now at the original. What we're thinking is the original text rather than what he's looking at. Bring it up. Actually.
No, I mean like at least the text as we have it right now. So in the Septuagint version or the Hebrew version as we currently have it. So either the Masoretic or the Septuagint version.
Yeah. So the thing is, it says he will be a priest on his throne, and then it says there will be a harmony between the two. So the text actually talks about them being the same thing. The king and the priest are the same person. In our current text, that's what it actually says in the current text. It doesn't say they're two separate people in Zechariah 6:13.
Well, I think it actually says that one will be on the side of the other, and if there's enmity between the two, that would suggest there's two entities.
Well, here it is. Okay, wait. Yeah, it is he who will build the temple of the Lord, and he will be clothed with majesty and will sit and rule on his throne, and he will be a priest on his throne, and there will be harmony between the two. So there's no standing next to.
Let me make sure I got the right word there.
I can check the Septuagint.
So it says the priest ho erius dexion. So at the right. Exion alto. So at his right, the priest will be.
That's in the Septuagint you're reading?
Yes.
Okay.
Or at least the Septuagint version I have in front of me. If it's off, I'll be corrected.
Let's check. Oops, no, that's not it. Hang on. Here we go. 6:13.
Second half of the verse.
Ah, yes, that's there, but it's not in the Hebrew. Interesting. Interlinear.
Out of curiosity, when it comes to tools, which one do you like to use the most? I've been usually using Blue Letter Bible, but I don't know if one is better.
For the Septuagint, that's the one I use readily. If I need to check it, I have actual 2 critical editions on the shelf behind me.
Okay.
But I don't find like tons of errors in the Blue Letter version. So
okay. I'm also thinking for the audience because they should probably check us as well.
That's the easiest to do. And in fact, I think the Blue Letter even gives you link throughs to definitions of Greek words. So that's
Yes.
super handy.
Yeah, at least most of them. There's occasional ones that there's gaps in, but it's more likely than not it's there, and then you can just check Google and find anything else that might be missing.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. So there's a discrepancy between the Septuagint and the and there is a priest at his right. Yeah. Yeah, the Septuagint does say that there's a separate person. And that's in the verse after 6:12, which is the verse that Philo's looking at.
Yeah.
Here, I tried to put this up to give some context to it, but the Blue Letter Bible, let me forward.
Can I give you a link?
Know.
Is there a way I can slop a link over, like in private chat? Yeah, here we go.
Oh, yeah, you could definitely do the private chat.
I just dropped in the Blue Letter, and then you can, once you're on that page, you can skip down to 6:12 or 6:13. I mean, I can't mouse over or anything for you, but and then of course there's the Hebrew interlinear, which I think is also very valuable for people who want to get into this. So I put that in there as well. That shows what's going on there. But yeah, so that's in the verse later where it does seem to be talking about 2 separate people, which is why scholars think that the Hebrew originally, like there's something missing, something got lost. Dropped from verse 12, and that's why you look in commentaries and when we're talking about what Zechariah thought, he's talking about 2 different people here. But there are several scholars, including myself, who've looked at Philo and are seeing him. Oh, Philo's reading a verse in verse 12, where he's seeing it as one person. And yeah, one could make the argument from verse 13 that Philo is wrong to do that, but that's getting at what Zechariah actually meant versus what Philo is actually reading here. And Philo's clearly not reading what Zechariah wrote because he thinks this is some weird archangel. It's obviously not what Philo's writing about or what Zechariah is writing about.
That's true. That he's definitely saying that this is an archangel, not either a human priest or a human king to be. He is very much in a whole other metaphysical plane. That's definitely true.
He's also saying that it's aptly named. He says like this is a perfect name for this guy because he is the firstborn, etc. Because he's made to rise as the firstborn, so he does a pun on this. So I think that the reason I conclude that what Philo's seeing here is he's seeing it Jesus being called this is because he's seeing these attributes being assigned to the same figure that he's talking. He sees the overlap of attributes, and so that's how he's coming across this. Otherwise, we have to assume that it's just a complete coincidence that both Philo and the text he's talking about mention a son of God and high priest completely unrelated to each other, just by coincidence. And I think any argument that requires assuming a coincidence is always going down in probability over an argument that doesn't have to adopt that coincidence.
Fair. I definitely agree that, when there are coincidences, we should be asking, is it more than just coincidence? Especially when there is all this, careful writing on that part, so people don't just write randomly and then put things together like it's Bible code.
Yeah.
Well, except people doing Bible code.
Some people do that. Yeah. No.
Right.
But there's a method to Philo's Pesher logic, which one can see throughout, even in the very next section where he talks about the other anatole, the one in Numbers 23, where again he's going completely off book, where he's like not at all talking about the same thing that's in Numbers 23.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So, so then it becomes the question of like, well, what weighs more, the context that would be in the Greek that Philo is reading, or the other points? In particular, you point out the fact that he says this Anatoly is the firstborn, but also Philo, when he says that this is the firstborn, he says he's getting this from another text that is said elsewhere. This is the firstborn. So it doesn't seem like he's saying we know this is the firstborn based on the verse or the context he cites. He's saying,
true. He
I know
doesn't
this
say
elsewhere.
he doesn't spell out the reason that he's like, he doesn't spell out all his logic, right? He's like he knows that this is a being who's referenced in multiple places. So yeah, he's not like he's not telling us all the things we would want him to tell. Like we can't like sit down and interrogate him about this.
Yeah.
But he's only interested in the fact that, oh, this guy is there. Here's a person in Zechariah 7 or Zechariah 6 verse 12 that is perfectly named Anatole, because as we know from other verses, he's also called the firstborn, etc. That's where we're getting to the idea that like, well, they're just, so we have the firstborn son of God and a high priest, and then another firstborn son of God and a high priest. And he's seeing, I mean, both are in this passage that he's seeing as being the Anatole. So I think really there's only two ways to take this: is it is a coincidence, just a coincidence, or he's seeing it because he's using Pesher logic, which is, oh, here's a son of God, high priest. We know my archangel is a son of God, high priest. Therefore, he must be the same person, and he's aptly named because God made him to rise, and so on. So that's really just the sum of my argument for the name, just for the name. For the archangel, there's no doubt, right?
I agree.
That's not even questionable that this archangel preexists Christianity, and the Christians thought their Jesus was this archangel. However, they came by that belief.
Yeah, and so in my opinion, the Steelman version I would take of your position about the archangel being named Jesus is that the Christians have definitely inherited this same like collection of Pesher and the logic for that, and they could have gone back and read this and looked even to more context and said, oh, here's a plausible name for it. And in particular, one thing that also kind of stands out that's a bit interesting, if we're not looking in Zechariah 6, but we see more about this Joshua back in chapter 3 of Zechariah, where it says that this Joshua is standing before the Lord along with Satan. And Satan is basically trying to accuse him, but instead Joshua is going to be given new clothing. And basically it sounds a lot like renewal, or even potentially viewed as resurrection, the changing of old garb to new garb. So I can imagine a Christian looking at this and finding so much Joshua, so much Jesus all over the place. But in that case, then we wouldn't be able to say that we can show that anyone was reading this as Joshua/Jesus is this archangel before the Christians. So my Steelman version is that you can derive it from that, but I don't think the evidence is strong enough to show that Philo himself made that connection.
Yeah, and so and that's a respectable position to come to. And like I said, the only thing is that I think that your position requires assuming an improbable coincidence, whereas mine does not. And so mine has a probability advantage over yours. And that is the argument that I made on the historicity of Jesus for the name assignment. I was actually surprised that people freak out over this, like somehow it's some serious threat to historicity that this is the case. It's really not. I mean, Jesus as being Yahweh's savior, that's what the word means, is a weirdly convenient name for someone who ends up being hailed the savior of Yahweh, right? So I already have suspicions about the authenticity of the name. Even if Jesus existed, it would be a weird coincidence he just happens to be named the thing that he goes on to proclaim himself to be, or that others proclaim him to be. I think it's more likely it's an assigned name, a name he picked up for himself to sell this idea about himself, or someone assigned it to him after the fact, whether he existed or not. So it doesn't shock me that there would be a pre-existent archangel. It's not a threat to historicity, but I think people have a really hard time like accepting that this is the case because they find some sort of threat in this, the idea that there was a archangel which when we know had many names. Philo says it had many names. He tells us one of them is Anatole, which is a weird name, which could have another name, Jesus, right? So, is Yahweh's savior. So I don't think that this is like some sort of big threat to historicity, but I think other people have a hard time with it and aren't willing to accept the probability argument because of that, because they're just so dead set against it.
Well, if I can interrupt a little bit here, I'm really loving the discussion, by the way, but I'm wondering if maybe the pushback or the problem crops up when somebody like myself kind of has this pre-existent archangel, connected with this name Jesus in, like, say, a list of things that, has pushed them from, being a staunch historicist to, a mythicist, or being maybe agnostic about it. I'm wondering if maybe that is the sort of threat that is perceived in that, there are some people out there that didn't know this before, and once they learned it, like that was one of the ideas that kind of opened up the possibility for Jesus possibly not existing or probably not existing. I'm wondering if maybe you guys can give your ideas about that.
Yeah, I think that gets back to the same point about the name. I think it's the name that freaks people out. Whereas the idea that Jesus was already this archangel in the earliest Christian literature that we have, regardless of the name, like set the name argument aside, that they already think Jesus is this same archangel that Philo is talking about. That I already think is like an eye-opening thing, because it allows you to realize that the context in which Christianity originated is very different and more bizarre than usually represented. And so this is what opens people's eyes to the possibility of mythicism, because now they're actually talking about a cosmic being that was already mythically created and believed in at the time. And then, of course, when you add the name onto it, and then that just is the last straw, I think.
Yeah, I think that, if you can, show this was a pre-existent entity, even with the name, and then you see the same characteristics hopping over into Christianity, then, that almost looks like a proof of mythicism. It's like, here it is as an angel, here's the angel again over here, and then all of a sudden, there's also all these stories have been running around doing Messiah stuff. It looks exactly like the euhemerization model, and it then becomes much harder to explain on historicity if this angel had already existed and the Christians are talking about it. I mean, it's still possible that historicity could be true, and they could just say our Jesus was that archangel the whole time that people have been believing in for the last 50 or whatever years, depending on how old this Pesher is.
Key that it takes away an argument rather than adds, right? So like it takes away an argument against mythicism. It doesn't add an argument for mythicism, because it's totally compatible with both things. And I think it's highly likely already that even if Jesus existed, that this name is some sort of cultic name that he assumed for himself, because it's too improbable that he would have that name, even though it was a common name and it was one of the most common Jewish names at the time. It's still 1 in 26 men named that. For 1/26 of the men, and just one of them just happens to start thinking that he's the savior of Yahweh. So anyway, I think I don't have a problem with the historical Jesus taking this name or being assigned this name. I don't see it as a threat to historicity. But you could say, like, well, where would they come up with this pre-existent archangel? Where would they come up with this idea? So, well, from context. Here's the context. And so once you have that context, you can see, actually, it's quite available. Now, there's a lot of more arguments you would need to add to really get to a mythicist conclusion. But this does start the train of thought, because now we know there was already an angel that they just had to assign this name to, and then decide, for whatever reason, possibly from seeing secret messages in Scripture, that he became incarnate and died, which is the one thing that Philo does not know about. Philo has no knowledge of any Jews preaching the idea that this archangel became an incarnate human and then died to atone for sins. That is the innovation that Christians are adding on top of this. And then, of course, you have to explain, well, why did they come up with that specific narrative for this angel? And that's where you can get into a debate between historicity and mythicism on that point. But once you have the angel, you're right. It takes away this idea that, well, they would never have come up with this on their own. It's like, well, they don't have to, right? At least this piece, they don't have to come up with this piece of it on their own. It's already there.
Yeah. If somebody's already processed the hamburger, then you don't have to explain how the cow was slaughtered. It's like, no, it clearly already happened. Right. But one thing, though, too, I think also that's been causing some consternation and some of the controversy is that in your book, the way that you presented your argument, I can follow it, and, we have our disagreement about how strong the evidence is. It's at least arguable. In the talks that have been, re-highlighted, the ones you gave, where it seems much more straightforward and direct. Philo tells us this, like this is what you're saying in this slide. Like Philo tells us, you give citations, and then it says the angel is actually named Jesus. If you go searching for that, it's not directly there, and it's an argument. And as in our discussion, there's evidence in both for and against.
Yeah,
and I think that's very different than saying Philo says something.
Right. If people just follow a summary of a book, they want to argue against what's being said there, they really need to go to what's being summarized, I think is the key thing. That is a fundamental mistake that people should not be making. And I know Godless, John's not making that mistake. Right. But if other people are only looking at the summaries, I mean, you could, because it's a different argument to say, like, well, pedagogy, I think you should word your lectures differently because in your book you argue this, etc. Like that would be like a completely different position than saying, oh, well, you're concealing the fact that it was an argument. No, it's right there in the book that I'm summarizing. And in fact, even in some of these talks, I even make the point. So it's like sometimes I'm being much more brief than others. Other times have more prolix. I have more time to like go into it. But I think if people are going to get like triggered by a summary of something, they say, well, that can't be the case. Well, then you need to go to what's being summarized and say, well, what does he really mean? What is he talking about? Go check this. Go check the study that's being summarized. Don't freak out about the summary. Is my position on that. And if people had done that, like we wouldn't have had all this drama about it. Like it just, oh, well, okay, look. And if you look at Richard's book, he's just making an argument for the name. All the other attributes are a slam dunk, that's for sure. But this one other attribute, whether it's a name, like he's got an argument for it. It's an inference. It's not actually in the text of Philo. Totally fair thing to say. That's just not what people said, right? And so I think that's the slipshod methodology that leads to these kinds of telephone game errors that people shouldn't do, I think. And you didn't do it, and John didn't do it. Like you both know what to do here, and handle it correctly.
But if I could just steelman the critique, at the very least, if someone reads something and it says someone says X, and you go and they don't say X, it's actually an argument. There's no way that one would get that from the talk, and I think that's poor communication at the very least.
Right, but take one of the examples where I said says, but then I corrected myself. I mean, attests. So I said says, but well, he attests to this thing. So if you're really paying attention, you notice I'm already making a distinction between what I mean by says, right? So, and so that should clue
the slide
people
itself,
in.
you actually had it say Philo of Alexandria tells us.
Right, tells us, and then I list the things that he tells us, and I said, and then I say, this angel happens to be named Jesus. So that's actually a separate piece from what he tells us, right? So, but I think
I would just have to say, as someone who would have been in that audience, no one can tell from that slide that sort of distinction between tells us that the archangel is a high priest versus the archangel is actually named Jesus. I don't think anyone in the audience could plausibly distinguish those two. So I think that's bad communication on your part.
Right. Yeah. I'd say like, in some of those videos where I'm being like too brief and I'm not specifying the distinction between the things he explicitly says and the things that we can infer that he meant. Right. So, that is true. Like, and I think that's a fair criticism. If that's all people said is like, well, actually you should be more clear in your summaries. Okay, fine. But don't make the summary my actual argument. And don't think that you can argue against the argument by arguing against the summary. Like you actually have to go check the study itself. And so I think that's the mistake that people, and that's the thing I made that point very early on in this whole thing is like, if that's all your problem is like, oh, I just think you should word things better in your summaries. Well, that's fine. But we wouldn't be having any of this discussion at that point because they'd be like, okay, yeah, sure. And then that would be the end of it. Right. Instead, there's this massive thing about like, oh, well, he's lying about this. And it's like, I'm not lying about it. I'm just summarizing the study. Go check the study. That's what I think this will come up later in our discussion is I think probably the number one by far mistake that people make in approaching mythicism is they don't read the peer-reviewed studies. They want to criticize them, but they won't read them. And if they claim to read them, they clearly didn't, because they'll say things of like, how could you have said that when you read the book? It is like a plain sentence that says the exact opposite of that. Right. I think the number one common problem we have is not reading the study. Go read the study if you want to critique it. And this is true for science. This is true for anything. If you want to critique something, you've got to go to the actual peer-reviewed study to do it.
Yeah, and also I try to give more weight to what people say in print when they're more careful, cautious, have to go through the review process. So like when I had my first blog post, analyzing where some of this debate/drama was, I was, saying, well, here's what was said in the talk, and that's not it's much more carefully said in this written source. So this is, the Steelman version of this as best as I can make.
Yeah.
But well, here it's still being missaid, so that's a reasonable critique, but it's a very different thing than what the grander accusation is.
Yeah,
and I tried doing that with everyone else's arguments.
Yeah, exactly. That's a pedagogy critique, which is like, a communication style critique, that's completely separate from the critiquing the argument, right? Critiquing the way you present the argument is different from critiquing the argument. Now, if people made that distinction, that'd be great. That would solve a lot of problems.
In my own view of like in comparing like the talks and everything like that. What I found was that when I heard Richard's speeches, the multiple speeches that have been highlighted, I always sort of broke up like the entire statement into a couple of different parts. The first part being that Philo attests to a pre-Christian belief, and then that pre-Christian belief includes Jesus as being, the name of this angel. And
Mhm.
so I don't know if that's the correct way to like diagram like what was said or anything. I've often thought that maybe I might be a little dyslexic or something like that, just because my mind does weird things
Does
whenever I
that?
read stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I have to read things multiple times usually in order to really grasp what they're trying to say. But that's what I took out of it. But I guess I can see how some
That,
people might not understand what was being said.
also, you read the book, right? So that you had that advantage. And I think like when this all started, and I won't name names, but when this all started, it was actually someone criticizing you for coming to this belief of mythicism because of this thing, and then they were trying to correct you by trying to like reveal to you that I have misled you in the wording. But of course, I never did, because you always understood what I was talking about because you actually read the study. So it was almost like a problem that didn't exist. It became concern trolling. It was like they're trying to rescue people from being misled, but they couldn't actually identify any actual person who was misled. And so that's why it's sort of like creating controversy rather than resolving controversy.
Well, that, and I was taken a bit out of context because in the referenced video where apparently something got triggered, it was actually in a list of things that
Right.
kind of leaned me in the direction towards it, which was more of a personal list of things that lean me in the direction of mythicism. But the bigger thing is that it's a list of stuff, not any one single
Yeah.
sort of idea. But yeah, so Aaron, did you get everything that you wanted to sort of discuss as far as Philo's angel goes? Because
Yeah.
I don't want to switch topics way too soon
Yeah.
on you.
Yeah.
Let Aaron add what he wants. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. I was going to probably just, put the bow on this, that from our discussion, I think we can agree that there is at least some debate about if Philo is connecting Jesus to the name of this person or not. It's at least an argument. There's evidence that can be weighed on both sides. And the way that was presented in this talks, I think was not well communicated. And if we do go to your argument in your book, it is more precise and useful. But I think there's at least reasonable criticism to both the argument and to the way it had been publicly presented.
Okay.
Right.
Awesome. Well, I do want to shift a little bit here to another topic, which I guess drew some ire from certain individuals, and that's the ascension of Isaiah. And I know that Aaron kind of wanted to discuss a certain thing around that. So I'll let Aaron again sort of introduce
Yeah.
us to what we're going to talk about.
Yeah. So I imagine most of the people on this channel have probably heard of the Ascension of Isaiah 100 times through various videos of John's. But nonetheless, for anyone who's coming in, the Ascension of Isaiah is this pseudepigraphal text that seems to have a complicated history of composition. It has been argued for at least a century about how old it is, what its sources were, how it was composed, if it was a unity or it's a whole bunch of parts stitched together by who knows what people. And the argument about its composition relates to mythicism, because the argument is the earliest version of the text seems to suggest that Jesus is pre-existent angel. I think we've heard about that before, but only comes down basically to the edge between the heavenly and the earthly realm, basically at what would be called the firmament, the sky dome of antique belief, and that this is where Jesus does his salvific acts, because he says that he will specifically go down to the realm of Samael. In the text, we are shown that Samael is basically Satan, and he's doing all of his stuff literally at the edge of outer space. So that would be, contextually where things are put. On the other hand, there's all these other glums on top of the base text, and the question is, what's first, what's original, is where the trouble is. Now, where has the drama been coming from? The question is, what does the scholarship actually say about the composition, and is that information being correctly conveyed? So I tried doing some deep dive into this specifically as related to one of the main scholars about the Ascension of Isaiah texts, Enrico Ornarelli. He's in, I think, University of Geneva. And in my research, I had to give like super extra credit, like what I learned about him, because not only is he, dealing with like these manuscripts in Greek, Latin, Slavonic, and Ethiopic, but he's also a language genius in terms of writing, because he's actually written his material not just in his native Italian, but he's also written professional articles in French, Spanish, German, and English. And when someone says they know a language, they might mean I can order a coffee in France, versus I can compose technical literature in French. Those are totally different things. And as someone who's trying to become fluent in some other language, hats off. That doesn't make his arguments right, but it shows that let's give mad props where due.
Yeah, and his arguments relating to the language, I think, are unassailable generally. So
yeah. And so Norelli basically was kind of leading a minor revolution in Ascension of Isaiah studies, basically arguing that there was really just two layers of composition. The earliest version is the part that's called the vision, which in the version you'll see is basically everything from chapter 6 to chapter 11. And then later the martyrdom portion was added on by someone else, and the martyrdom is chapters 1 through 5. So originally, chapters 6 through 11 was its own independent writing, and the question is, in that original version, does it actually have a only cosmic Jesus? Because the later on martyrdom edition definitely has a Jesus doing stuff on Earth. That seems to be more Catholic tradition or Orthodox tradition, whatever you want to call it for there. Norelli argues that the vision is older, but it also did incorporate this, what's being called a pocket gospel, which also seems to involve some Jesus on earth, being born on earth, doing the normal gospel stuff that we read in the canonical accounts. So this is conversely what's being presented, especially more recently, by M. David Litwit, who, by the way, I very much respect his research. His books are almost always excellent. Any mistakes I find in them are very small. I actually am also like a Patreon supporter of him, so I completely support the stuff he does. But in this particular case, he's unfortunately even done more than drop the ball, because he is making claims about the composition history of the text, which is in agreement with virtually no modern Ascension of Isaiah scholarship, and definitely not Norelli. And I literally found like half a dozen different works of Norelli all saying the same thing, so that someone was basically treating the whole text as a unity. So that way he's, citing chapter 3 to argue that this can't be a mythicist text, when Norelli says, no, that's a later edition. It just shows he's never even engaged with the original text. So that's obviously a problem if you're going to not know the history, but then say, here's what Norelli says. And the biggest problem is the fact that Litwit is literally saying Norelli says that the whole work was always a unity, that it was always together. And that's simply false if you believe Norelli's arguments, which also seems to be the consensus in these positions. So the fact that Litwit is saying these things, saying this is what Norelli argues, the fact he's taking what would actually be a complete minority position, and seeming completely unaware of that, along with making other mistakes about it, I have to believe he's actually never read anything from Norelli at all. And that's unfortunately damning of Litwa and his normal, very high caliber scholarship.
Yeah, which it surprised me. And John and I did a video on this where I was really surprised that someone like Litwa would do this. Because he could have just said, hey, I haven't read Norelli. I think it's really important to read Norelli, so I can't comment on this. Or, well, I haven't read Norelli, but according to Knight or according to Charles or something like that. But that isn't what he did. And I am mystified by, you've listed just like one of his mistakes. He made several in his discussion of this. But to get it to the theme that we're talking about today, which is what do historians get wrong about mythicism, this is another example of just not reading the text, like not reading the study. And Litwa did this to me before. So when he did a review, he has like a little pocket review of my book, critique of it in his book, How Did the Gospels Become History? that is just a garbled mess that shows that like he didn't even read the text. So he clearly read it close enough to like clip out sentences, but he gets them so out of context and so presents them so incorrectly that he's clearly not reading the text. It's like he's just rage skimming the text. And I don't know why he would do that. Like you look at his other work, he doesn't do that. He's very careful and he takes time and makes sure he understands the context. You know, so why on this one issue does he do this? And he's not the only one that's done this. There are many historians who've reacted this way. Yeah. When you get to like the Philo issue, we have people like Larry Hurtado trying to insist that Philo never even called it an angel. It was just an abstract concept. And like, I mean, if you had just read the text, like he claimed he did in that case, and like Litwa claimed to have done, he claimed to have read my book, to have critiqued it, but he clearly didn't. Hurtado did the same thing. Like he makes these arguments. We catch him on the argument, like, look, it's in the text that you claim to have read. Direct quote of Philo calling it an angel and an archangel, and talking about it as a person who is a personal agent who engages in personal agency and so on. It's not an abstract concept. And his response, like, is basically just to walk away and pretend he never said any of the things that he said. And so that, I don't understand why historians do that, because they don't need to, right? Like they could just make some other kind of argument, like you've done today. You could just make an argument that actually acknowledges the facts as they are, and then just make some sort of argument from those facts, rather than just get the facts completely wrong and like just be super lazy and not even check anything. And I don't understand why you would do that. And so like when Litwa did that, like repeatedly made all these false statements about it. And false statements also about what I've argued. Now, he didn't explicitly name me, but it's clear he's talking about mythicists who do this, which means me, right? So he could be talking about Doherty, but even Doherty says things in his books that approximate the things that I've said. So you can't claim not to know them if you've actually checked, right? So even if he'd read Doherty, he would know what the arguments are that he's supposed to be responding to. And that would have been different. Like if he'd said, well, look, he could correctly describe Norelli and then respond to the arguments, whether it's Doherty's arguments or my arguments, and like state what our arguments actually are, and then give his reasons for not finding those arguments cogent, right? Like that's what he could have done.
And relatedly, has been the issue. And relatedly has been the issue, like in Litwa's book, and again, I try to cite his book as much as possible because this is where he's forced to be more careful in what he says. It has to pass the review. And in there, like the only source that he uses to attack your arguments about the original version of the Ascension of Isaiah is 3 pages from one of Norelli's commentaries, probably his most important commentary, but those 3 pages. But he never says what those arguments are, and he definitely doesn't weigh Norelli's arguments against your arguments, because you don't just say this ain't original. You provide reasons. Are they good reasons? I would love if Litwa compared those to what Norelli's were, and well, I again decided to reread those couple of pages again today.
Is that the PDF you sent me?
Yes.
Yeah. I just went back through it too. I can skim my way through Italian, and then some of the pieces that I knew were relevant I put back into Google Translate to make sure I was reading it right. This is what I haven't seen this in like 10 years, right? So because this is a really hard book to get a hold of. So I really
this
appreciate
is a late birthday gift.
Yeah. Well, it's not the whole book. That would be a great gift to have.
You would not want me to send you the whole book in picture form. That would be like a gigabyte.
No. Yeah. Well, actually, I wouldn't mind that, but I would be astonished that you would spend the time to do that. But no, any form would be great. But I haven't looked at it in like 10 years because it's really hard to get a hold of. And so I'm just going off of my memory. And I remember, looking through it and saying, like, there's no arguments here for it. And by the way, that's only with regard to, because my position that 6 to 11 is separately from 1 to 5. I go, oh, Norelli completely argues the same position. Mm-hmm. He's with the majority of scholars. He's with me. So there's nothing to argue with him about on that. So the only thing that was relevant was, the pocket gospel, the chapter or sections 2 to 22 of chapter 11 of the Ascension text. And really, like, he's only got like 2 pages, really, maybe 3. Yeah, like you say, 3 pages. Where he's making
and actually, in terms of argument that's relevant, even less than that. Really, all of his argument. Because I reread it again today. And when I say reread, when I say reread, I mean I also had to use machine translation. Fortunately, Google Translation is so much better today than it was even 5 years ago, let alone 10 years ago. Between Indo-European languages, major Indo-European languages, it's very, very, very good. Especially
and I can vouch for that because I'm facile with French and German, so I'll read scholarship in French and German. Not fluent, but I can peck my way through. And I could actually correct French and German translations through Google Translate. Like Google Translate would kick something out and go, okay, need to fix this, need to fix that. But now I notice like I rarely have to do that. Like only like on very like if it's a technical terminology or something, do I ever need to do that? So it has
but I will note,
visibly gotten better.
But I will note, its Latin still absolutely sucks. Do not use it for Latin translation.
Yes, I did notice that too. I was noodling around using it to try and do some experiments, and it's not great.
But nonetheless, when I look at it, so the vast majority of that section about the Pocket Gospel is mostly arguments about what was the original Greek text behind the Latin and Slavonic version of the short version of that. And basically, it's a lot of engagement with some of the earlier arguments from R.H. Charles from 1900. So a lot of old scholarship being dealt with there. And really, the only part of that whole thing to argue that the original verses 2 to 22 were the original form of what was there is one paragraph. That's literally all the argument, and all it relates to is what was being found amongst the Cathars, or allegedly amongst the Cathars. Like, this would be 1,000 years after the likely composition time. So, and that's literally all the argument Norelli provides. He provides basically two arguments. One, that the version that we find in the Latin and Slavonic doesn't seem to fit the context well. It looks intrusive.
Yeah, which is true, right? So like clearly something has been removed. Yeah, it's missing from the Latin and Slavonic, and I make that point too. So I totally agree with Norelli on that. But that doesn't get us to the Ethiopic insertion is what was there. And that's what the other argument is. And like you said, he only has one argument for that, which is this, 1,000 years later, Cathars knew about what's in the Ethiopic version, but we all agree that version comes from a Greek redaction of the 2nd century. Yeah. So that doesn't tell us anything about the manuscript history of the Latin. He has like a one-line kind of implied argument where he says, well, this is the Latin used by the Cathars, but I don't see him presenting any evidence that that's the case, that the Cathars are using these manuscripts that we have of the Latin. I don't see that. He just doesn't present any evidence. He just asserts it. And I guess that's supposed to support his argument in some way. But anyway, it's weak T, and it doesn't tell us anything about the manuscripts, which is what I want to know. Like, I don't care what's going on 1,000 years later with heresiologists, because we know that text is already floating around by then, and that doesn't help us at all.
And not to mention, we don't actually get what the Cathar text was. We get basically what other people said the Cathar said under torture.
Correct.
This is like the worst kind of late evidence you could expect. So I'm like, there's like 8 levels of removal of what I would use to reconstruct a text in another language.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. No, you well put. I would have said the same thing. And I remember now rereading it, I remembered emotionally saying there was nothing in there for me to like bring up and respond to on the historicity of Jesus, other than what I already say. So getting to reread it and see like, okay, I'm having the same emotional reaction. It's like, there's nothing here to even bother waste time with what burn pages on. So that's what surprises me. People say like, oh, but Norelli refutes Carrier. You got to read Norelli. I'm like, what? What is Norelli? Like, tell me, what do you mean? I don't
exactly.
Understand.
And like I say, and
I don't know.
Yeah, and then it can compare like how Litwa tried, what did he do to basically refute your argument that the Pocket Gospel is an interpolation at some point? All he did was say, Norelli says no, and that's it. So we don't know what the arguments are from Norelli. We don't know what the arguments are from you. We don't even know if you have arguments. Doing critical scholarship is you take both sets of arguments, you put them next to each other, and then you show to the reader why one set is stronger than the other, or even come up with new ones, and you come with some sort of synthesis. You don't just say, Norelli said so, and our argument from authority.
Right, and, well, he did worse than that, but what you did for the Philo thing at the beginning, the top of this show, is an example, like, you correctly read back the person's argument to them, and they're like, yeah, that's my position, and then you state your arguments against, and they're arguments that are informed by the actual arguments you're responding to, right? And further debate could be had, but at least like you're interacting with the scholarship, right? And that's what Litwa didn't do. Not only did he just name drop Norelli as if somehow, I don't know who told him this, because since he didn't read Norelli, how does he know Norelli says anything useful? Like, this is something, and I see this getting cited by apologists a lot. So I think he just heard it being said a lot. So he's, oh, this is something I can just say.
Yeah.
It was really lazy. Like that's not how you do it. And then what he could have done is like interacted with my argument, right? And just responded to what my arguments were. And then instead of doing that, like you noted, he made a bunch of weird arguments that show like he doesn't even know what the majority position is or any of the scholarship on Ascension by Isaiah. You could do better than this. Like there is a possibility to make, you know, a decent argument at least that on both sides of this.
Yeah,
that would be productive. I would like to see that.
Yeah, and again, because I think Littwer's work is so high caliber, I kind of wish he did, like, you know, bring all that skill to this debate, because I think he could bring up useful criticism to the mythicist position. I think he's more likely to convince me of historicity if he was, you know, treating it with the full force of his skill set, because I can tell if he put his mind to it and did it critically in the same way he is, you know, did like in Dies Dies and other works and the rest of how the Gospels became history. I am pretty sure he would move my needle on historicity at least somewhat, but he has failed to do that in this case, and it's just really lackluster and so outside of his normal quality standards. So that's what's upsetting to me.
Yeah, I agree.
But I also should note that, Richard, your position that the Pocket Gospel is a complete later insertion is, from what I can tell, also a minority position. So I would at least recommend that, you know, based on our discussion about what Norelli says and what little evidence there is for that, it might be good to make your own standalone peer review article to send out. So that way you can try to see if we can move the consensus on that, rather than it being very, you know,
right. It'd be sitting in the book, doesn't get addressed. There are actually other scholars who've done this, but I don't think anybody's done it as thoroughly as I do it in OHJ, like putting it all in one place. So that actually would be useful. So I'll put that on my list of things to do at some point.
Yeah, I would say that's a strong recommendation, and that'll do things to move the conversation forward, academically speaking.
The lawyers want me to say that nobody here is questioning Litwa's PhD or saying that he shouldn't have one or anything of that nature. We respect him as a accomplished scholar. We just simply have some critical opinions about his performance in this particular respect. Okay, now that we got that out of the way, thank you so much for both for a great discussion so far, which we've actually got some super chats. One from Ekadriabu, who says, nice discussion. Keep the good one, or keep it up, I guess. Maybe. And I have to say that this is a really good discussion. And we do have a few more super chats to go through before we continue on with the stream tonight. If you guys want to, y'all can send super chats in, and we'll discuss, you know, the super chats at certain points during the discussion tonight. We are going to be heading into another section about, you know, discussion and everything, which we've kind of already been talking about a little bit here. But we do have Derek from Mythivision, who says, Merry Christmas, guys. In case you're wondering, both Doctors Richard and Aaron turn water into wine. I don't know if anybody knew that they could do that, but that's awesome to hear. As far as the this particular comment, kind of connects the two discussions we've already had. Andres Nawani asked, Dr. Carrier, where are you getting the idea of Philo's Jesus being a pre-Christian concept from? Ascension is dated post-Jesus by most.
Ascension. This is confusing two different things. So this is the Ascension suggests ascension of Isaiah question, but the Philo question is different. So we don't have precise dates for Philo's works. We know that in the time of Caligula, he was already a well-respected scholar and elder, because he's chosen to be an ambassador to, I think, Caligula at the time. So people date his works generally between the 20s and 40s AD, which is crossing right over when Christianity began. And you can look at it two different ways, or three. There's three different causal models here. One is Philo's getting this idea from Christianity, but the evidence suggests that's not the case. He has no knowledge of Christianity. Christianity is getting this directly from Philo, which is possible. Like the dates of his writings fit just before Christianity. Or the third possibility, which is the one that I mentioned on the historicity of Jesus, is that Philo is repeating common Jewish rabbinical lore, right? So these aren't original ideas that Philo's just making up, that he's describing things that are believed by other exegetes and other scholars of the time, so that Christianity and Philo are independently getting this material from earlier sources. And a good example of this is the doctrine of two atoms. And there's been scholarship in the peer-reviewed literature on why does Paul talk about two atoms? There's the original atom and Jesus is the last Adam. And then Philo talks about two atoms. There's the one atom for Genesis 1 and one atom for Genesis 2. One of those atoms happens to be the angel we're talking about. And there seems to be a lot of overlap between them, but they're not directly saying the same thing. So Paul has some sort of ideas that are similar to Philo's, but they're not identical to Philo's. And so is there some sort of common ancestry to both Philo and Paul? And so that's the usual position, is that there's some other, we just have a lot of lost Jewish writing. And that's where Paul and Christianity would be getting these ideas, not directly from Philo. It's possible they're getting it directly from Philo, but it doesn't have to be, because Philo is just a snapshot of Jewish scholarship at that time. We don't know where he's getting these ideas. He doesn't meticulously cite his sources. He doesn't name drop which previous rabbis he's getting his ideas from. So we don't know. Both models are possible or compatible with the evidence that we have.
All right.
Yeah.
And then Derek from Mythicism says John can also attest. He drank that wine. I don't normally drink wine. I'm more of a whiskey kind of person. or yes, honey, or Bud Light. Thank you.
Oh, come on. Have some standards.
Have some standards.
Every time I see my mother drinking ultralight beer, I'm just like, come on, Mom, don't.
Well, I'm diabetic, so I can't exactly I can drink craft beer, but it has to be on very rare occasions. I guess. Yeah. So, but so let's continue with our discussion tonight, and that's with how to have these discussions better. Now, I know that Carrier kind of talked about that a little bit, like the way to have better conversations is to steel man the argument, to actually, read the scholarship and everything like that. But I'm kind of curious, Aaron, do you have any ideas about how we can better have discussions on this topic without it triggering 4-alarm fires and everything like that? What are your thoughts?
So, well, when it comes to triggering or not triggering, I think that might be inherently impossible. That, especially with a topic so culturally important as Jesus, any discussion that doesn't follow various lines, whether atheistic or theistic orthodoxy, people are going to be, have feathers ruffled. But we can still always do better. So steel manning was mentioning, and I like the way I think it's Daniel Dennett puts it when it comes to steel manning, that you should be able to present the argument of your opponent so well your opponent says, wow, you put that argument even better than I did. That should be the goal. As best as possible, express what the other person is arguing. Now, I mean, in some ways this almost shouldn't even need to be said, but especially with the way the internet works, the way with politics works, the easiest way usually to win an argument is to turn the argument into something or interpret it into something that is much easier to rip apart. Well, unfortunately, of course, if we do that, then it just becomes who can do the best straw man. And even eventually we run out of straw. It just isn't worthwhile for making the advancements. Now, conversely, though, and this is something I know Richard and I have had some back and forth about over email, and we should probably, I guess, talk in public about how do we then, of course, address with criticism. I totally agree that Richard is right in his blog posts to say, hey, here is where such and such person is wrong, or such and such person has a terrible argument, and pointing those out, documenting those, show that the person hasn't done the appropriate research, or they've misread things, or haven't read things as the evidence might be. Always, judicious with whatever that evidence is. That is totally appropriate. Where I've been having some issues in particular with calling a fair number of those critics literally insane. And that's something like an exact phrase that I've seen sometimes in the blog posts. And
but not of Litwa. I haven't. Well, no, actually, I do say there's one crazy thing that Litwa says, which was him attributing my anti-Christianity to having a battle with a demon as a child.
Yeah.
That is a bit weird.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah. And again, I don't condone Litwa for misdescribing the hippopompic
Hypnopompic hallucination.
hypnopompic hallucination.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. I need more coffee.
But yeah, my point being is I
Yeah,
I
yeah.
do say that what that claim is bonkers, but
Yeah.
I've never like said that he himself is insane.
Right. I don't remember you ever saying Litwa is crazy, but like,
Right.
or insane. But I have you seen use that language with James Charlesworth. Um, uh, that's the one that's coming to my mind most
Well,
instantly.
that
Or
was
Joseph
again the
Hoffman. I
argument.
know that's come up.
The argument is
Um,
bonkers. That's what I said. Is his argument that Lazarus can't have been the beloved disciple because recently resurrected people can't run fast. I have called
no,
that
I believe
argument
you actually
bonkers.
said that. I think you said actually Charlesworth himself is insane.
Okay, if I did, I don't recall that, but it's possible.
Yeah, and I mean you've called several other people insane or even literally insane. There's been
Yeah,
some of
like
the yeah.
Hoffman, for example. Yeah, no, because his behavior was definitely off the charts of sanity for sure. And Eisenman, I saw Eisenman get shouted off a stage at a conference once because of his crazy rambling. He definitely these are cases where we are looking at issues of serious cognitive problems that I think do need to be called out, and I think people need to be aware of them when you're evaluating their arguments.
Well, I can think though there's a big difference between someone making bad arguments and that they actually have a diagnosable medical illness. And
True. But when people are so irrational, like if you have to be shouted off the stage at a conference because of your rambling, weird discourse, that does not track well. And then when you look at like the sort of crazy Bible code stuff that he goes on saying, that does not look like a sane person's behavior. There's something not rational happening there, fundamentally not rational. Hoffman had the same thing where his behavior getting really strange and paranoid and forgetting things that he'd said and things like that are indicative of there's some sort of cognitive issue that you need to be aware of and not assume that he's a rational operator. Because if you have evidence of they're no longer rational operators, that is key information that you need to know before you try interacting with them or try relying on them.
yeah, and just going through because I had when I made my blog post, I also collected a much larger sampling of you calling people insane, crazy, mentally ill, literally insane. That like literally found like a half dozen examples, and that seems hard to justify that there's just that many people that you're interacting with on this subject that all have medical diagnoses or should have that, and that seems
Well, I interact with hundreds of people, so the rate of mental illness is
but I
well
mean
above
that it's
6
always like
on
with your
there.
critics that it keeps coming up over and over, and often what is driving you calling them that is that they're making bad arguments, and it's just like with my own
Well, let's be
experience
clear.
of
I don't actually just call someone insane for making a bad argument. Like there's tons of people I point out make bad arguments, and I don't think that they're insane.
True.
But when people do things like get shouted off a stage for their rambling rhetoric, things like where Hoffman was like completely off the book of his crazy paranoid behavior. And like when people act like that, yeah, you got to go that far. There actually has to be evidence that you have gone off the rails of rationality for me to actually make that claim. And then I got to present evidence. I'm not going to like just say it as the case. I got to be able to present evidence that there's something fundamentally irrational about this person's behavior. And so if I have evidence for that, I'm going to say it. And I think in the only cases where I've done that are like that, where I can present evidence that these people have, that the people I'm talking about, which are very few people, the people I critique and interact with, are just irrational, like in some fundamental way that makes it impossible to interact with them.
I definitely know there will be some people like that. Yeah, it's almost impossible to have meaningful conversation. Nonetheless, though, when you are going and calling people mentally ill and saying things like that, to what end does that actually help? Does it help the person? Does it correct them? Or does it just become to them an insult? What does it communicate to other people other than again, look to an outside observer that you're throwing mud in these sorts of cases? I don't think it's an effective strategy either for correcting that behavior or convincing people that you're right. It's I'm looking at this and seeing this is someone who just goes into instant vitriol, even if you have reasons. The thing is, though, everyone will say they have their reasons for making their claims that such and such is insane or a liar or stupid or things like that. It's too easy to make that claim, and it prevents
Yeah.
everyone else from engaging with the argumentation.
That would be a good point if it was arbitrary, like if I just do this all the time. But if someone has a history of lying, as Litwa does about me, like Litwa has lied about me, lied about my work, or lied about reading it, one or the other, that's a lie. So,
and I should actually quickly note, in my earlier blog post, I tried defending Litwa from being called a liar because I thought I could come up with a plausible explanation for how he made the mistakes about what was in the text of On the History of Jesus. But with the more deep dive I've seen about Norelli and Quintel, he hasn't read that, and yet he's trying to act like he has. I have to now switch and say, no, he has actually lied about this.
Yeah, and also my book too. Like, so he lied about reading my book. When you have a pattern of lying, I think people need to know that, because that means you can't trust this person anymore. If they say something, you need to fact check it. You can't rely on them. So it is actually crucial information. I don't think we should hide the fact that people are lying. If people are lying, that is a serious problem. That's information people need, so they know how to interact with this person. They say, this is not an honest person, so I shouldn't trust the things that they say. I need to fact check it before I ever cite them or lie on them. And I do the same thing with people who are exhibiting like crazy irrational behavior. Like, don't act like this person is a rational operator, because your inferences will then be false. You need to operate on the assumption that this person might not be altogether, their memory might not be reliable, their behavior might not be trustworthy because of this. And there have been other people I've said, like, I don't want to interact with this person because I think they're having a mental health crisis. And that to me is simply just the truth of why I don't want to interact with the person. And that's more of a just, I don't want to like bother with this. But if that person is gonna keep interacting with me and keep making accusations about me, then I have to interact with them. And then what happens is I'm going to document what they did, their behavior. If it is weird and irrational, well, that's information that people need to know. That means there's something about them that is unreliable, which means if they keep making claims and statements and stuff, you have to operate from the assumption that, well, they have made insane statements before, these statements might also be insane. We need to fact check them before trusting them. And so this is information about whether you should trust a person as a source, or whether you need to do more diligence than you would normally do with someone sending information. And so that's why this stuff is important. You can't brush it under the rug. We can't act like these are rational, honest people when they aren't. Right. So if people exhibit repeated behavior that indicates a particular style of thought, that's information that people need, and they need the evidence for it, so that it's not just a claim. I'm not just asserting someone is crazy. I actually have evidence of their insane behavior, the irrational behavior. So I never make these statements unless I have evidence. And so what I want people to do is just check the evidence. Like, don't just say, "Oh, stop calling people a liar." No, actually check, like you did with Litwa, right? So like, no, check. If I make a claim that someone's lying, I will have presented evidence for it. So you will have all the information you need to actually go and check and see, am I right? Or am I wrong to call them that, right? So I think that's what people should do, is like fact check me, right? Like check me. And if it checks out, well, then now you have information that you can't trust this person anymore. And I've run into a lot of certain bloggers and certain other people that I have this, where I've gotten to the point where I don't even bother reading their material anymore, because they're so consistently lying about things. Right. And so I think everybody needs to know this information. So right. This is why
I think what you're saying there is reasonable, and I think I generally agree that you should be documenting when people are saying and doing things that are highly reproachable, either because the argumentation is bad or the behavior is bad. But the thing I have noticed, though, is that if it comes to, is it having an effect of actually informing people and keeping them away from bad arguments or from bad people and things like that, or making people not try to make those bad arguments in the first place, that's not what I see happening. They see like the way that you describe Bart Ehrman, and then they see you as the person who is just constantly throwing vitriol. Or if I can give an example as well of someone expecting your reaction and then not like doing better with that in mind. So 6 years ago, when I was at the Society of Biblical Literature, I was at a talk that was being given by Daniel Galata, and this was a couple of months before his review article came out about your book. And his talk was also about mythicism, and he was trying to compare it to other conspiracy theories or even like ancient aliens, saying it's kind of like at that sort of level. And I also remember him like in the talk or in the Q&A basically saying once that article comes out, he's going to be really stressed because he's going to be expecting your reaction to come in. So he knows that you're going to react, but did that actually cause him to do a better job fact checking? I know you're going to say no because there was plenty of things amiss in that article.
Well,
but here's
that
the thing.
article would already have been written by then, I think. So
well, I mean, here's the thing, though.
He'd already pulled the
like
trigger on that. Yeah.
Well, the thing is, though, he wrote that article and already basically expecting the cost of doing that is hearing vitriol from you, and he doesn't take into account. I better do a better job fact checking to push back as much as possible on Rare Carrier's arguments.
Yeah, I disagree.
It doesn't.
I don't think that's what happened
didn't
there.
change that behavior.
No, but that's the point, right? You should be aware of that. That means what he's scared of is me fact checking him, right? So that's the thing that's really telling there is that he doesn't even care to get the material right.
Well, no, actually, my point is he's not even seeing this as fact checking. He's seeing this as Carrier is going to flip his lid, and I'm just going to now take that as part of the cost of writing this article.
Well, that sounds like an apologetic for lying, right? Because if he knows his material is crap, like he knows he's misrepresenting my stuff.
Oh, no, I don't think he thinks he's misrepresenting. What I'm saying is he isn't thinking Carrier's going to attack this. I need to double down on the quality of this. He's saying Carrier's going to react badly, so it doesn't matter what I write.
What I did was document all his errors, right? That's what he's afraid of. Because he knows I'm not just going to go on my blog and just rage blog him. He knows I'm going to fact check him. I'm going to find the things that he got wrong. That's what he was afraid of. Now, why would he be afraid of that unless he's doing due diligence? So you can say, you know what? I did a really good job to make sure that I got this absolutely right. So any shit that Carrier throws at me, I know is going to be bogus. That isn't what he did, right? He did a really sloppy job. And to the point where like he's really pushing the level of honesty in terms of how he represents the contents of the book. So if he's going to do a sloppy job and he's worried about being fact checked, I don't think it's the vitriol that he's worried about. I think he's worried about being found wrong, and he's sort of basically creating a preemptive apologetic, say, "Oh, Richard's just gonna throw vitriol at me, and so I can just ignore it." And that's just a way to pad the audience to say, like, "Oh, don't bother reading. He's just gonna attack me. There won't be any actual fact checking that's going to expose any errors I've made." This is the kind of behavior I see from Christian apologists a lot. Is they try to inoculate the audience against the inevitable destruction of their own arguments by making these kinds of arguments, making the kinds of claims that, oh, that atheist is just an angry atheist. Don't even bother wasting time listening to what he has to say. When, of course, what the atheist says is like complete knockdown of everything they said and correcting their facts and so on. So that doesn't tell me anything. So that apologists are going to be lazy or dishonest and not actually do due diligence in their work, I expect kind of all the time. There's very few Christian apologists that I've ever met that actually do good work when it comes to things like this. They actually are trying to shade the evidence, and they actually are trying to make a rhetorical argument rather than a sound argument. So that doesn't surprise me at all. I'm not going to persuade him to do that. Like, I think he's already gone. He's already full in, right? He's already bought into the arguments he's making. He never corrected them, right? Mm-hmm. Gulata's never come out and said, "Oh my God, you're right. I made all these errors." No, right? He's sticking by the false things he said, even now he knows they're false, right? So that tells you something about Gulata, right? That tells you something about his character and whether you can trust and rely on anything he says, right?
From what I can tell, though, the Academy hasn't taken your view on that. I believe he's still in grad school. I'm not 100% on that.
I think he has a PhD now, doesn't he?
I honestly don't know. I mean, it takes so long to get a PhD in this subject matter, but I honestly don't know.
I had operated on the assumption that he had the PhD when he published that article, but maybe I was wrong.
The last I looked, it said he was still in grad school, but he had switched from Yale to something on the West Coast, but I forget.
Okay, I didn't know that.
Well, he also switched his interests. Like, he's now mostly focused on American and Mormon religion.
Interesting. Okay. Didn't know that.
Yeah. But yeah. But like I say, though, it hasn't caused the Academy to say, "Oh, this is a bad review article." That hasn't been the case. And
well, because they're not checking, right? That's the thing.
Yeah.
They're trusting it. They're trusting what he says to be true.
Right.
And but this is the scandal that we need to prevent. Yeah. We need to get scholars to stop doing that, to stop trusting that these things are true. They
Right,
need to
but-
actually find out that these things are false, right?
But I think the
So-
approach that you took might have also been preventing that, because if people are coming in and seeing Angry Richard, that I think is putting them off from treating your stuff seriously. And I want to converse that with other stuff that you have debunked extremely successfully. And as far as I can tell, those things are now dead. So I remember when you extremely thoroughly debunked Jerry Vardaman claiming there's micro inscriptions on coins. And I reread your article on that recently, and
someone
it didn't
who was
have
crazy.
the thing is, though, I don't think you actually ever used the words of crazy, insane, or things like that.
I'm pretty sure I did. Yeah.
I did a word search through the document.
So, well, sorry if I can interrupt. I did do a keyword search on Carrier's blog. He did in fact call Vardaman insane. It was
Okay.
in a
on his blog. I
comment.
mean, like when I say
I think in
Vardaman,
the articles too. Yeah. No, I wasn't
did
the
you-
only one. I wasn't the only one saying it. There were other people that
yeah.
he got fired from his job secretly over this, over being insane, basically, not being a trustworthy scholar anymore, because he was basically doing like tinfoil hat stuff.
yeah. When you
But
see
to be
the
clear,
letter J,
he also is deceased, and was deceased when I published. So there wouldn't have been a Vardaman response to my article. I think whether it's dead, I agree. It's just because I've exposed it now, so like no one's going to rely on it. But you still see it pop up. I don't know if Lee Strobel has cut it from his book that keeps getting reprinted.
Case for Christ, yeah.
I mean, because that's where it was promoted.
I remember that.
Firstly.
And just also as another example, when is the last time anyone has brought up J.P. Holding and tectonics?
Yeah, there's a reason for that too. Weirdly, Holding has decided to argue against Christian heretics instead of atheists now, so he's kind of taken himself out of the game, frankly. Which, and he did this in the middle of a debate. He announced this in a debate, our last debate together on the textual reliability of the New Testament, and completely tanked the debate because he says, "Well, I'm not really going to argue against these positions. I'm interested in arguing against Christian heretics now." So anyway, I think he's the one who's kind of like tanked his own apologetic ministry on that regard. That's the reason we don't hear about him.
Yeah, but also conversely, nobody is citing him. And the thing is, like, when you were critiquing him very thoroughly on internet infidels, and then in Not the Impossible Faith, your approach is much more gentlemanly, that sort of stereotypical form.
I disagree. I think you should reread Not the Impossible Faith.
Maybe I ought to then. My memory was
it's just as ruthless as I normally blog.
Okay,
but always straightforward.
Okay.
I'm always straightforward, right? Like here's what someone says, here's what's false. If I catch someone lying, I'm gonna present the evidence for it. But I think I think people just don't like being critiqued, and so I think they'll make up any excuse to sort of inoculate people against that. So I don't think that helps.
I'll just point out, like, from being like a former professional teacher as well, if the goal is to change behavior, you don't even necessarily want to do that to the person as well. That you definitely want to present, say, here's what you said, here's what doesn't match, and cause that cognitive dissonance and make them stew over it and change behavior. If you come in with accusation, with things that are more straightforwardly personal, that just really puts the defense barriers up, and it's really hard to make any progress or change.
Yeah, I don't think people who've already committed to lying are changeable. I think they're a lost cause, because they're never going to come out and say, you know what, I've been lying all this time. That was really bad. I'm going to completely change my character and tell the truth from now on. That never happens. Once someone has committed to lying as a mode of discourse in argument within scholarship, the only thing left we can do is expose that so that people stop trusting them. Basically, people have to stop using them as a source because they've discredited themselves in that regard. And so that's actually the purpose of catching people in lies and documenting them, and say, this person lies. You need to know that. You need to know that this is not an honest person. And so that's why I bring it up. And if people have a problem with that, what they should do is fact check my claims. Like if I present evidence of someone lying, check it. And see if you come to the same conclusion, like you did with Litwa. Once you actually dove in and said, like, okay, look, Richard's right. There's no way he could be saying these things without lying about one thing or the other. Either he's lying about what's in Norelli, or he's lying about knowing what's in Norelli, or actually is essentially Isaiah scholarship generally, because that's not just Norelli he's dropping the ball on there. But that is behavior that is censurable, and I don't think Litwa is going to change. I don't think he's going to repent and become a good person. I think he's just established that when it's this issue, he can't be trusted. He's just not going to do the work. He's not going to be careful. He's going to represent himself as knowing things that he doesn't. And so anything he says, people are just going to have to fact check him from now on. You just can't trust him anymore. And it's only this subject. I've not caught him doing this on any other subject. If everything else, which is annoying, because I was like, yeah, you got to trust him on stuff, but this one thing, like, why this one thing? Does he have to act this way? There's no reason to. Like he has all the skills and abilities to handle this well. And I just wish he would. But he's gone all in. He's decided not to do it that way, and so people just need to know that about him.
Yeah, and I will note again that, like, say, I am totally in agreement with documenting when someone says something and it doesn't match the facts. I guess my approach is much more to lay it out as the facts and not also say, and now this person is, a terrible liar, because then that's the headline, that's what people see, and it distracts from anything else, and it creates the tribalism that I want us to fight against. And I think it's very possible to lay out the facts and show it that there is something not right here, and maybe I'm just imagining things more like a Perry Mason moment, like I'm going to present the facts and make the person switch on the witness stand, which I know is just total Hollywood stuff, but nonetheless I want to avoid provoking the things that just leads to tribalism between the individuals or academically or with other observers, because we are seeing that tribalism in even this community, and I want to avoid that as much as possible.
It's the tribalism that's wrong. That's what we should be criticizing. And I've done this too. I've done things where I've not finished I've done the enthymeme thing where I've not finished the syllogism, where I presented someone making a bunch of mistakes, and then I'm still accused of calling them a liar. It's like, well, what are you saying then? That they're a liar? So I can't avoid it, right? So all I can do is say what I think is the case. If I show and show someone radically getting something wrong that they claim to have read, there's no other conclusion to draw than that they're lying about something. All I'm doing is being honest about that, rather than just listing the facts. I'm still going to get accused of calling them a liar, whether I use the word liar or not. Just as with Bart Ehrman, he constantly calls me incompetent without using the word incompetent, right? So he uses the sly sort of indirect way of attacking my credentials and capabilities. Mm-hmm. That's not any more admirable or honorable. If he would just, right. So so it doesn't really help to erase the word liar. That's not going to make people suddenly think that, oh, Richard's suddenly no longer finding liars anywhere. No. If people are lying and I present the evidence of it, if I don't draw the conclusion and put it out, they will. And so there's no way avoiding this. The only way to avoid it would be to not talk about it, which is absolutely not the thing that we should do at all.
Yeah. And I agree with you. We definitely talk about it. I'm ultimately talking about a different way of talking about it. And I know that's a little bit meta and maybe even just a little bit annoying, and because it reminds me of I shouldn't say annoying. I should say more it's that it feels like it's not the sort of thing we should be having to worry about. We should just be focused on what the actual facts are, rather than the exactitudes of how we say it, because of having to walk on eggshells to get it the right way.
Yeah, absolutely agree with that. No doubt
but
there.
in many ways, it's also not so much I think this goes back to Julius Caesar saying, it's not enough to not have any proprieties. We can't even have the appearance of impropriety. That unfortunately, even appearances can matter just as much as the actual facts, and taking that into account affects how we should be communicating.
I agree. The correct response to that is for people to start engaging honestly. That's what I want. I want people to start engaging honestly. If people do that, then we wouldn't have a problem.
And I can totally agree with that. And I did do a quick site search for insane, like I said before, and there's actually only a very few instances of direct calling somebody insane, mostly with Hoffman. There's also on a list of responses to Defenders of Historicity, there's a couple of probably insanes with Maurice Casey and Stephanie Fisher. Mm-hmm. And then there's some questioning Is Hansen insane or a liar? It's hard to tell. So there are those particular situations there on the blog. And if anybody cares about my particular take on this, is it's just sort of a difference in communication techniques. I've had plenty of people tell me that the way that I am a little abrasive in my commentary and my videos and everything like that is not necessarily wrong. It's just not how they would do it. And so I guess I can appreciate both sides. I get what Aaron is saying about communicating and reaching people, but I also understand Carrier's side of it too, because I guess I'm a little bit on the side of Carrier when it comes to a lot of my responses to people. But I do think that one of the key aspects that I got out of this particular part of the conversation is that I feel like people need to focus more on steel manning or focusing on getting the counter or the arguments that are counter to you correct, and actually reading those and portraying those accurately rather than just focus on dunking or focus on just belittling the other side as much as they can, which I've seen people on both sides do that, although in my own personal opinion it's primarily starting on one side but then keeps going back and forth. But I do hope that we can start to have better conversations on this topic, but to transition from that into common scholarly mistakes that are made. I know the last couple of times I've let Aaron kind of go first, but Dr. Carrier, do you want to start us off?
I would rather Aaron go first on this too. I'd be curious to know what, because Aaron interacts with a lot more people. Like, I don't interact with everybody, right? But Aaron interacts, sees a lot more things going on and being debated and stuff. So I'm curious what Aaron would put on the list of common mistakes or misunderstandings or whatever that he sees.
Well, sorry, Aaron. I just got alerted that a couple of pertinent super chats have come in. So we got Rainbow Krampus earlier, who says we need more fist fights in academia. Nerds, put up your dukes. So that's not exactly helpful for the last conversation.
No, that used to be much more done between Harvard and Yale during their football games. Like, literally, people would die on the field back in the old days. Like, that was the real college spirit.
Casey, my lovely wife, sent herself some money to say, I think the point is that you're not qualified to diagnose mental illness. You can absolutely say their argument isn't rational, but some of the stuff you say distracts from your otherwise exceptional takedowns. Any thoughts there, Rick?
I think in the cases where, because it's very few cases where I'm expressed concern about someone's mental illness, it is behavior rather than bad arguments, right? It's so if someone's behavior is beyond off the rails of rationality, not the behavior of someone who's actually sane, I'm not diagnosing a specific mental illness. I'm pointing out that there is something cognitively wrong with this person, and there's evidence for it. Like Hoffman's like really bizarre paranoid behavior is an example. Eisenman's tinfoil hat behaviors. Vardaman is a really good case of that, where Vardaman's literally seeing things that aren't there, and so like that indicates to us that this person's basically broken with reality, and that's something that we do need to know about them. And certainly, like Vardaman's a good case of this. Like, you cannot trust. Well, he's deceased now, but you could not trust his descriptions of evidence. Like, he's saying, "I'm seeing these letters on these coins." No, he wasn't, and I don't think he was lying. I don't think he was making it up. I think he genuinely believed that he was seeing these letters on those coins, and he was seeing things like J's and W's in Latin letters from the ancient world, which is especially problematic for someone like him who knows that J's and W's don't exist in ancient Latin. So the evidence of him being insane was really strong. Like, it was so strong it got him fired, basically, right? So we don't need to be psychologists to notice that. Like, if we have that much evidence, then people need to be on alert about this. Like don't interact with this person like they're rational you need to be aware that they're not going to interact with you in a sane fashion. And so I think that's still important information. I don't think we should throw around insane willy-nilly, just accuse anybody of insanity with no evidence. But when they engage in really weird behavior, then we're in that category of this is not normal. There's something seriously wrong here, and that you can't trust them basically for that reason.
And I'm just going to add a coda to this that it can be, though, hard, I think, to tell the difference between strong, motivated reasoning and actual break from reality. And, just from personal experience, I've had people close to me with like literal breaks from reality, and it doesn't look the same sort of thing. So I'm very uncomfortable using the same terminology for both, when what I'm often seeing a lot of this is just straight up hardcore motivated reasoning, which is unfortunately part of the human condition. It's something that I suffer from by just having this meat brain.
Yeah, everybody's got inherently irrational brains, right? I tell people all the time to go to Wikipedia, look for a list of cognitive biases, and the list is hundreds long. It's huge, and that's just the natural operation of the human brain. So yeah, we do need more than just mere irrationality, mere motivated reasoning for that kind of concern, basically, to be raised.
Right. And then we've got the Mythic Life, who says, if only Constantine had lost the battle at the Milvian Bridge, we might be celebrating Saturnalia instead of debating the finer points of Jesus's historicity. Eo Saturnalia, almost.
We'd be debating the historicity of Romulus, because there'd be people who desperately need Romulus to actually be historical at that point.
Yeah. Yeah, we'd actually have non-fictional Romulans running around.
Yeah. I'm not joking. I think that actually would be the case. Like counterfactually, and I make this point on the historicity of Jesus with King Arthur, is that it got to a point where denying the historicity of King Arthur was so closely equated with denying the political goal of a unified England, the United Kingdom, basically, that people couldn't disassociate. They couldn't decouple those two things. And so that the historicity of King Arthur became important in a way that it wouldn't normally be important. And Jesus, the historicity of Jesus is like that. It's important for reasons that have more to do with politics and worldview than have to do with the evidence. People don't have this problem. Like, they have less of the problem if I say, I'm not so sure about the historicity of Confucius, for example. And because, they say, well, okay, I'm not invested in whether Confucius existed or not. And the evidence for the historicity of Confucius is weak. And the name is also a generic name. It just means the master, which is Master Kong, which is not, it's a super generic. It could be anybody, right? But that doesn't trigger people. But I think if we had this counterfactual reality that if Christianity had never become the thing and we were, Roman polytheists, say there's some sort of global modern technology Roman Empire now, there would be some sort of mythical figure that would become, their historicity would become important psychologically and politically, and we'd be having the debate about that, whichever that was. Romulus would be the best bet.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, that's all the super chats we have for right now, as far as pertinent to that previous conversation. Now we're coming up near the end of our live stream tonight, but we do need to get to the actual what's supposed to be the topic, the common scholarly mistakes. So, Aaron, what are your thoughts on the common mistakes that scholars make concerning mysticism?
Well, I think a big part of it that probably does so much to push away modern scholars from diving into it with any care is the fact that the way that almost every scholar encounters it is the internet undefensible version of it. The Kiersey Gray / Acharya S / Zeitgeist versions that get repeated over and over and over again. Just the other day on Gnostic Informants channel, they were looking at these memes that are passed around in atheist internet forums to show, here are all the gods that are born on December 25th. Among the gods born on December 25th was Zoroaster. And I'm just like, how many mistakes can you make in one statement? Come on. And if that's the sort of thing that a scholar sees when they say, why don't you consider Jesus mythicism? I'm like, because you don't know jack from shit.
Yeah.
That's gonna push people away.
It's also true that those memes are a problem.
Yeah.
You know, I had a rep for attacking that stuff. Like that was what I used to do when I was the editor. I was a feedback editor for the secular web. Is that I was like making fun of mythicists all the time, and I wrote the article against Kersey Graves, explaining like, just stop citing Kersey Graves, please. And that was a long time ago. That was ages ago. That Kersey Graves article holds up, by the way. Like, still should never be citing Kersey Graves.
Yeah.
But yeah, when you see the Horus stuff, that like religious, got into religious, which really made me angry. Like, because you could have put there could have been a good example, and instead he ruined the whole movie by putting a completely bogus, easily debunkable example of where Jesus is based on Horus. No, he's not. That's not at all plausible.
Yeah.
Tons of factual errors in it. So yeah, that stuff goes around. But I do think, and it does make it makes it more difficult for us who are doing proper peer-reviewed versions of mythicism when people keep going around spreading these things. And there are some shows that, some YouTube shows that are still pushing, cockamamie theories, mythicist theories that they shouldn't be doing. And of course that becomes the face of mythicism when it shouldn't be. But the only solution really is that people just need to focus on what has passed peer review. And I tell that to other people. Every new person who comes out with a book that they say like, oh, I've got this new theory of the Jesus myth. And like, get it past peer review, and then we'll take it seriously, right? And you can't say you can't because it's been done twice. So it's not. You can't say it can't be done. So that's my view. And
and I definitely think that's true. And I've also spent some time debunking bad mythicist things. In particular, I've taken the time to debunk zeitgeist in terms of not just the myths it pulls to, because I think that's actually been done well to death. The thing I actually focused on to show is wrong is it doesn't even get the astronomy right that it tries to use to explain everything. And with this celestial alignment, you can see that, and it's like, yeah, that alignment is actually astronomically impossible. So that isn't what the Egyptians were saying, and you got jack and shit for evidence for that. And so I do think that there is also value if mythicists are also going out and doing a much better job of policing what other stuff is out there. So it's not just absolutely flooded. So if other scholars are actually going to take it seriously, they don't have to deal with and say, okay, 99 versions of the mythicist stuff is absolute junk, but this one over here, that's it. They're going to look at that and say, 99% of the time it's total junk. What's the chances this one's any good? And not to mention the fact it's often so recycled. So many of the arguments are even like near identical that were what mythicists were arguing in like the early 1900s. And thinking like, well, this is just more of the bad version of history of religion school stuff. And I say the bad version just because there were less and better parts of that approach.
Right. Yeah.
The better stuff is now modern comparative religion stuff. But yeah, that doesn't help.
For the audience, plug your here's your book on the Bethlehem Star.
Mm-hmm.
But where else could they find, if it's possible to find, you talking about the bad astronomy in, for example, works and things?
Yeah, I specifically did a long interview with Neil of Gnostic Informant on just that subject, that we basically went through like every major astronomical or astrological claim and show them, here's why we know this is false, by like saying, like, here's a basic star map, here's what it shows. If they're going to claim,
awesome.
or they were claiming, they were looking at precession of the equinox, and I went through the history of science of like how we discover the precession of the equinox, and no, you can't just see where the sun is on the solar solstice because you'll burn your effing eyes out. You're looking at the sun, for Pete's sake. Simple things like that people say, well, we're just tracing that along, and I realize, no, you're not just tracing along. You're looking at that in astronomy software where you can turn the atmosphere off. This is not the same thing. And I mean, I also have to point out elsewhere where it says, so like in the GCRR conference last year, I think it was, Frank Zindler, I missed that talk and only later in the recording saw that he also brought up precession of the equinoxes to explain the Christ myth. And again, he doesn't realize two important things. One is, no, you can't see where the sun is for the solstice. And two, he doesn't know the difference between constellations and astrological signs. Mm-hmm. They're not the same thing. And so when he's saying, well, I'm just looking at a star map and here's where the sun was, it's like, no, that's not actually how astrologers define the boundaries.
Right. Yeah.
So it was like multiple mistakes in one, and he just doesn't know because he doesn't know that history of astronomy, astrology, because it's boring as shit to read about.
Yeah, but you didn't publish any of those critiques though, so people can't find them.
Yeah, it's only in YouTube format. I don't have like a book published or an article published because
well, that Neil, did you talk about the Zindler one in the Neil video too?
We talk about precession because it comes up in Zeitgeist.
Okay. Yeah.
And
I
show,
right.
Yeah, and I say, here's how it was discovered. Here's how hard it is to actually observe. It's so hard to do. Ptolemy couldn't improve on what Hipparchus did 200 years later. So no, people weren't looking at this. At most, they were looking at an almanac. And if you actually graph out when the transition from one sign to the other was going to happen, it was going to be like 500 years after the beginning of Christianity. So behold, I come quickly. That ain't astrology that's going on there. So it's things like that.
Yeah. Right.
Well, if I could interject here real quick, one trend that I've noticed of I guess in the realm of mistakes being made is that a lot of times people will have on scholars who seem to only address the crank mythicism, which I think that as a minimal mythicist, I think that all of us here would push back against those bad ideas, but it seems to be that that's the only version that people dismiss. Do you see, or not dismiss, but discuss? Do you think that it's actually incumbent upon scholars to interact primarily with the peer-reviewed scholarship, at least on a primary level, and then say, well, this is not in the peer-reviewed literature on this, like this particular argument is not like an academic position. Do you think that those caveats should start being made as far as this conversation goes?
The caveats, yeah. I don't have a problem with someone like making a career out of like carefully debunking the bad mythicism. But if they say like, yeah, I'm aware that there's like peer-reviewed mythicism, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about this other stuff. Like as long as they're not equating the two, then that's just a personal preference of what someone wants to study and write about and so on. So I don't have a problem with that. I would like to see more scholars engaging with the peer-reviewed literature. I'd like to see more engagement with Lataster, his book, for instance, taking it seriously. And also I personally would like to see more scholars doing a comparison, for instance, like Galata's article versus my book, right? Like do a study where you're actually comparing the two and then publish your article rather than making it me that I have to do it. So then it's just me talking about it all the time. I would like to see scholars doing this, doing their own deep dives and publishing results like this.
A reviewer of a review.
Yeah. I mean, it's a review of a debate really. Right.
Yeah.
So, yeah, absolutely. I would like to see scholars rather than just dismissing it and saying, oh, I'm not interested in that, or I'm not touching it. Get involved and like actually do a proper comparison and fact check, like who's got the better arguments, pro and con. Could be a mixed bag, it could be the result, I don't know, but I would like to see it done, right? I'd like to see more scholars taking an interest in doing that, as they would do in any other debate, like the Q debate, for example, or anything like you can find articles where people are discussing. Well, the Ascension of Isaiah is a good example, where you'll find articles where people are discussing the debates about it, and that's what we need, is more scholarship paying attention to like are the critiques valid? Are some of them valid? Some of them not valid? That kind of thing. I'd like to see more scholars being engaged in that way. That's what I'd like to see.
I will note, though, that your recent blog post suggests that there is actually progress on that front, because you did a written debate it's now in Italian.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's showing that, hey, you actually have some scholars properly engaging in written form to make it as scholarly as it gets. When you put it on paper, therefore it's scholarship.
Yeah, right. No, that was good. I would like to see more work like that done. It's a little difficult for people to access right now because it's in Italian. I will try to get the English edition out sometime next year. I don't know. It depends on whether I can find the time to produce it. But it does lack the one thing, though, is that my chief opponent in that, the renowned historian Fernando Bermejo Rubio, he already sort of he argues from like conceding a bunch of things because he agrees with mythicists on some aspects of the debate. So like he doesn't engage with certain aspects of it simply because he doesn't believe in them. So like he doesn't defend them. So you don't see a thing where he's like comparing Richard Carrier to Galata, for instance. Like you don't see that. You see him like just taking seriously what is in my book and then making his arguments against that in defense of his particular theory of historicity, which is still productive. I still would like to see that done too. That's great. I just like to see more scholars looking at the debates and then evaluating the debates and writing about it.
Yeah, and that means, of course, to also advance it, I think other mythicists who want to make a good case need to also continue to publish and actually show this is actually an active, lively, productive paradigm rather than a one-time thing that can be accused of being an anti-Christian treatise.
Yeah, which ties into the point you made at sort of the top of the show. Like, do you want to seg into that?
Yeah. So I need to note that I am not trained as a biblical scholar or classicist. My degree is in physics. So the only thing that's relevant is the Bible is made of particles. I studied particles, therefore. I would only call myself an advanced dilettante. That's the only thing I can justify calling myself.
Honestly, you do really good work in the field. Like your book on the Bethlehem Star is outstanding. I still think it's the definitive treatment of that story, because you actually take the bother, like you did with Norelli. Like you actually will do the research and dive in, and look at how much you can accomplish if people would just do that.
Yeah.
Right. So yeah, but you've presented at the Society of Biblical Literature, which is no small thing. So that's
I've done that twice now, and in part to, I can't say directly advance mythicism, but basically that's the paradigm I have in mind. So what can I do with that and see what's there? So one of the talks I did was about the nature of euhemerism in antiquity, to see that there are different flavors of it, that it can be both anti-religious and pro-religious, that it can be used to mock other beliefs, or it could be to encode or make philosophically sound other beliefs. And of course, the idea that Richard argues on the History of Jesus is that Jesus is a euhemerized deity or angel, or whichever term Jews or Jewish Christians might have used back at that time. And say, okay, if that's the category, well, let's see what's actually the literature there, what sort of framework can this fit into. And one of the things I also want to work on, I need to actually try to make publishable, is there a way that we could actually create criteria to detect euhemerism in a given myth and see if there's a difference between history, legend, or euhemerized legend? Is there actually any way of detecting that, so we can come up with some sort of criteria and see, do various bits of the Gospels pass that or not? That's one thing I presented a little bit back several years ago, and if I actually had, allocated my time better, I would have tried publishing. At that time, though, I was way too busy. I was still teaching high school, and that's such a time suck. Strangely enough, I've switched now, working in the private sector, and now I have free time.
Yeah. Did you never publish the euhemerism article?
No, it's one that I need to, and especially after this most recent talk I did at SBL, because when I presented there, I basically had like half a dozen people come up and say to me, publish that as fast as you can.
Yeah, right. Oh, I mean the presentation you just did, you mean?
Yeah, the presentation I just did.
Yeah.
And it also relates possibly to Jesus mythicism, but indirectly. So it's completely consistent with historicity, but it's solving a mystery in the book of Revelation. Specifically, the vision that you see in Revelation 12 of the woman standing on the moon, crown of stars on her head, clothed with the sun. What the hell is this? Where does this come from?
Right.
If you are reading the Old Testament, the number of space ladies is very, very small. So where does this vision come from? And conversely, there's also the title that Jesus has in there that's also repeated in 2 Peter, that Jesus is the morning star. Where does this come from? There is the star prophecy, but it only says that there will be a star rising, not specifically that exact title. So where does that come about? And I was able to find, actually, there are precursors to this that you can find. Some of them you can see in literature after the writings of many Christians. Some of it you can actually find before. I'm 50-50 if I actually found it in Philo. His grammar is a little bit ambiguous, but he might also be talking about a morning star there as well. And then I figure out, okay, this is what this entity is. And here's the pesher I think that might have developed that. So here's the two verses that go together. Here's the evidence that I can show that people were actually making peshers out of these verses. See that it can make sense of that. And then I realize ultimately this pesher can make sense of both the title of Jesus and the visionary experience in John. So awesome. I've now solved two mysteries with one pesher.
Yeah.
The question then, of course, is what's the relation of this pesher with the rest of Christian literature? Again, the title of Morning Star is seen in 2 Peter, which is not a visionary text. There's this idea floating around in Christian circles. How far back does it go? And one of the things that I'm going to try to argue in the future, I didn't argue this at SBL, but I'm going to try to argue in future stuff, that this was originally about the resurrection of Jesus. And it's like the same sort of thing that you can see in the Star Hymn of Ignatius. Maybe it's also behind the missing part of the Ascension of Isaiah. Obviously, we can't prove that, but
well,
there are things
right.
that fit.
It's right. It sounds like there was something like that in there. Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, we can't prove it, but
yeah.
The tantalizing clues are there. That's true.
Right. Yeah. And the fact that there's actually apparently some textual relationship between Revelation and Matthew. So I'm trying to see, is it actually possible for me to show this could be an example of euhemerization from Jesus as Morning Star to star at Jesus's birth? That's an angle I'm trying to go about. And again, this whole approach, this whole paradigm only really becomes plausible if you think Jesus is a myth and euhemerized, and you're now looking for the evidence of that euhemerization. This could be consistent with historicity, but you wouldn't think that this would be worth your time. So that's why I am like attached to this approach, and I want to see what fruition it can come from. I want to be the Kepler to the Copernicus in that sort of way. Here's the original thing, and now what can I do to advance it, and what new predictions can I make from it?
Yeah, I can attest to. I read at least a draft of your euhemeris article, and it was really good. So it's totally publishable. You should definitely dust that off and try to get it published. And this sounds publishable as well, I would say.
Oh yeah, yeah. I literally had half a dozen people come up and say, "Publish that as fast as you can because I want to cite it."
Yeah, no, that's awesome. And I would say, like, generically to the answer to the general question, that you're touching on one thing that I think we could do, or that other scholars could do, which is just reconstruct the pesher. Like Paul constantly talks about, we learn from Scripture that Jesus was crucified. We learn from Scripture, etc. He tells the Galatians, I presented it to you. I showed you Jesus crucified, right? And it's actually pro-written is the Greek word. So he's talking about scriptures. And he's talking about mysteries, and he's often talking about like how Scripture tells us things, like 1 Corinthians 2, he mentions the whole hidden Christ thing goes on in there. So there's some sort of pesher that they're building. And I think doing some sort of attempt to reconstruct this pesher, that would be basically the commentary they would have written out. Peter might even be walking around with a scroll of just a list of verses that would be his cue sheet, like a musician, right? Like he would go through and like, oh, here's the cue. This verse in Isaiah 53 means this, and then that would be like launch a sermon on it, kind of thing. So they clearly had this, right? Whether it was an orally memorized list of scripture verses or it was written down, it existed. And again, it's true whether Jesus existed or not. This is the case. But you're only really going to be motivated to really look for it if you realize actually they're getting Jesus entirely out of the scriptures. Once you admit that, then the pesher becomes more important to reconstruct. So I think there's now it is a vexing thing to pursue because we have so little information to go on, and we really can't reliably reproduce it exactly. So we can only talk about possibilities and limited pieces of it and things like that. But still, I think that's an area of research that would be inspired by mythicism, if the whole field were to embrace the paradigm.
Yeah.
On the other end of it is the Gospels. Forget trying to get historicity out of the Gospels. Rather than if you look at a gospel commentary, there's a lot of talk about how to get what's the true story behind the myth. The new paradigm would be, we're not even going to do that anymore. We're going to talk about where are they getting this story? What is the point of the story? What is the structure of it? So Dennis MacDonald's Mimesis criticism is a really good example of that. And he didn't originate that. Like finding Jesus as rewrites of Moses and Elijah, that's been in the literature for ages. So that the field has already been doing this, but they could do it more. And like let's just do a commentary that's just based on where is all this stuff coming from, and we're just not even going to like assume there's any historical Jesus that it's coming from. And again, that's compatible with historicity, but you desperately want to try to get some history out of the Gospels until you give up the paradigm and realize like, no, actually the Gospels are completely making everything up. And that means we can study them differently. We say like, well, okay, then Now let's figure out, why are they making the things up they're making up? Where are they getting the content and stuff like that? I think commentaries could be completely rewritten from that perspective, and do more of a deep dive search for the kind of, what is the allegorical basis, what is the mimetic basis, and so on. Those are the paradigm shifts. If the field were to adopt this paradigm, that's what I think would change. Two big things I think would change, that would change in terms of direction of research. They're not radical changes. Like, this field still does these things a little bit. It's just not centered and not pervasive.
And it's probably to show like the magnitude of things. One of the talks that I went to when I was at SBL was about the historical Jesus seminar. So first off, the room was like the largest room they had, and it was completely packed. That's where the attention goes. And I forget who said it when they were up there, but they said like in the last century, approximately, the number of books written about the historical Jesus was so great that the average rate that a new historical Jesus book came out was one every 9 hours.
That's so amazing.
Yeah. So imagine that energy, that scholarship, all that thought process wasn't so devoted into, maybe he said be nice to people, historical Jesus reconstruction, to, this other paradigm. If that energy had switched from there, I think we could probably make lots of useful progress, or at least outline our uncertainties far better, because we've been at this construction of the historical Jesus since Remaris in the 1770s. And I think at this point, we're not going to make any more progress in any serious way. We've tried, and we've tried. Maybe geocentrism isn't the way to go. Let's try this other model.
Yeah, whereas like mimicist criticism has been very successful, more so than the field, I think, is acknowledging. It's really good evidence that Mark is building stories out of Paul, that he's building stories, I'm going to say it, out of Homer, that he's building stories out of the Septuagint is already mainstream accepted view. Like, so, and there could be other things, like what about Apocrypha? What about the biblical antiquities? I mean, there's studies of the nativity of Matthew that admit that the biblical antiquities, which is this often neglected first century Jewish sort of fan fiction collection based on the Old Testament, that they're getting ideas from there and to build out the nativity of Matthew. There was an article that analyzed, and you rarely find this, but there was an article analyzing, based on the assumption that Luke is rewriting Matthew's nativity rather than saying that they don't know each other. What then? Why is Luke making these radical changes that he does? And there's really good productive analysis I found in that. So the stuff gets done, but yeah, can you imagine if the whole field were to be throwing its energy into doing this, and then we could build out like the entire basis of Mark's gospel, like every inch of it. This is what Mark is doing, and we have good evidence for it.
Yeah,
and you don't need the historical Jesus to do that. Basically.
Yeah, in fact, I should highlight an article, because I literally highlighted this article just a few hours ago on Mythvision, because I did a stream there about how the story of Jesus in Matthew was constructed. And in particular, there was this article from 2010 by James Patrick, and basically argues that like pretty much all the citations that you see in Matthew is following Pesher's strategy. So there's basically like these 10 passages from Isaiah that Matthew is using, and using that to basically construct. So while an outside observer might just see, oh, these look like just a bunch of random citations, but when you see, no, here's the actual continuous Pesher logic that he's using, now it makes sense of why he's making the citations the particular way he does for his both contextual and for choice of words. And you realize, oh, this first off means the guy's a literary genius, and two, oh, this is how the story's actually made.
Yeah.
And if the same strategy is used for the nativity story, that's used for the discourses, which is also then found in like the trial or what have you, and you realize, okay, if it's the same strategy everywhere, why assume there's anything actually historical or provably historical if this is the way he's going about it?
Yeah, that was James Patrick 2010, you said?
Yes, in I think it was the Journal of Theological Studies.
Nice. Okay. Yeah. That is exactly the kind of thing I'm talking about. And that ties in both the things I said, reconstructing the Pesher and rebuilding the basis of the Gospels. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, my quick question, I guess trying to play devil's advocate a little bit, is that I can see somebody saying that the Pesher reconstruction is a bit speculative or maybe possibly ad hoc. What would you say to that? I would guess, say issue.
It's less so than historical Jesus reconstructions actually are. Like we have better evidence for these kinds of arguments, and for the possibility space at least. Sometimes we have better evidence for just the fact of it, but sometimes you can carve out the possibility space of what possible, like you can talk about, like, there's 5 different theories that all fit the evidence. Knowing that there's those 5 and not others is already progress in our understanding. So carving out possibility space is itself progress. Whereas we get the historicity of Jesus, like the possibility space is just, it's just vast, and we haven't really done a good job of, we can't narrow it down. We've tried all these tools, they don't work. So yeah, I think there's way more speculation and way more seat of your pantsing in historical Jesus reconstruction than there would be in this kind of work. I think that you can get more access at the Pesher and the logic of the writers because you have the texts to work from. So you're not trying to reconstruct something that you're multiple times removed from multiple unreliable sources. So anyway, that's my reaction to that.
Yeah, and to add to that as well, and also note, Matthew is basically coming out and saying it, I'm getting this from Scripture. So when someone is being explicit that this is how they know it, maybe we should believe them.
Yeah, take it seriously. Yeah, I agree. To remind John, I threw into the back chat 2 articles that I've written that are relevant to what the whole theme of today, which is how people could interact with mythicism better. With actual like models of how the engagement should go. I did 2 articles on that. One was the difference between a historian and an apologist, and the other was how to argue Jesus existed. And both of those go into like the steps that I would like to see scholars do rather than what they have been doing. And by scholars, I mean everybody, even like amateurs who want to get involved in this discussion.
Sorry for that little bit of a delay. I was working on getting these 2 articles in the description there so that people can go and check them out. I do appreciate that there, Rick. One question that I did have going back to the Morning Star thing concerning Jesus and Revelation. I had thought that Satan was known as the morning star. Is that also true, or is that a misconception?
It is true. So here is what's going on. So everyone, get some popcorn. We're good. It's story time.
Yeah. No, this is why I love what you do, Aaron, because you're like these are areas that I am not well versed in, and so when I hear that you're like doing this stuff, I'm like, I'm excited. I want to see what you come up with. But
yeah. So once upon a time, there was a little boy named Isaiah, and he decided that he wanted to say that he was talking to God, and he comes up with all these prophecies. They get put into a book, and they say, yeah, Isaiah said these things. Among the various prophecies of Isaiah is this dirge against the Babylonian king, and this is in Isaiah 14, and specifically in 14:12, he says, and you, in the Hebrew, Hallel ben Sheker, shining one, son of the morning, you think you're going to basically rise up and take control of the divine council. No, instead you're going to be thrown low and go to Sheol. So basically, you, Babylonian king, self-declared bright son of dawn, you think you're going to actually run the show? No, go to hell. That's the basics of what's in that original context. Later, this fall of Hello Ben Sheker, which then gets translated into the morning star, son of dawn, in the Greek, and then later in the Latin, the same sort of thing. This then also gets tied in with the fall of Satan when he is thrown down from heaven. You see that, for example, in Revelation 12 as well. So when people are then thinking Satan was, originally in heaven or at the edge of heaven and then was thrown down, they're looking for examples of that later on. And here we have the star being thrown down by God and now has to literally go to Sheol, go to hell. And so this was then interpreted as Satan. And what's the Latin word for the morning star? Lucifer.
Yeah.
So that's the basics of what happened there. But this, most of this glomming on of this is actually about the fall of Satan seems to come 2nd, 3rd century later on. So it's after Revelation. And before that, there are other morning stars. I can find that in the Sibylline Oracles. I can find this in Joseph and Asenath, which is a Jewish novel from before the Common Era is usually it's dated. It might be in Philo, and I also think I have good evidence that it's also in the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs and the Testament of Levi in there. Sometimes it's called the bright star instead of the morning star, but in Hebrew, they actually call Venus the bright star. And also in Revelation, Jesus says, "I am the bright star, the morning star." So it's a synonymous term in that case.
Yeah, and Lucifer in Latin is bearer of light. So
yes,
it's the same valence that we're talking about.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So it looks like this was a title that was actually being used to some sort of angelic being. It gets attached to Jesus through whatever Pesher logic. The Pesher logic, I argued, that is ultimately a combination of the numbers, or the star prophecy in Numbers 24:17 and Psalm 110, or at least a reconstructed version of Psalm 110. There's a lot of argument about the Hebrew because if you read it as is, most of it is incoherent. Like, literally, if you go to the NSAB translation for verse 3 of Psalm 110, there are 4 footnotes noting ambiguities, and the last one is just, we don't know. They should have just had a shruggy emoticon there. But there have been, like, other ways of saying, hey, if we use this different vowel pointing, different than the version found in the Masoretic text, it can become more coherent. It looks close to what you see in the Septuagint. And in that version, it's basically saying that... so Psalm 110 is basically about the coronation of the king. In verse 3, it makes it sound like that king is a son, his birth from the dawn, is literally a child of dawn. So if you believe that the king in the star prophecy, well, it's a star, and it's a star born from dawn. What's a star born from dawn? That's a morning star.
Yeah, and I wonder if, like, the one about the Babylonian king could be read as, oh, you think you're the morning star.
Yeah,
and thus
it's
actually referring to the morning star being a good being, or the genuine being, but Satan is someone who pretended to be that or thought he was that, but he wasn't. Is that?
Yeah, my guess of what might be the original context is when like I've read like a fair number of books trying to actually figure out where the myth of that Isaiah is playing off, because it talks about this person going to the top of Mount Zaphon, which is where the Ugaritic pantheon resided. Things like that. So they're looking Ugaritic myth and other things like that, and they can't really find a match of this character named Hillel. But I think it's actually a bit of a pun, because the Hebrew word for Hillel can both mean bright and boastful. And so I think it's a play on saying, oh, you boastful one, you think you're going to actually run the show. Fuck no.
Right. Yeah. No, so that's good reasoning. Yeah.
Yeah. That's at least my best guess, but I should also note my Hebrew is probably not enough to get published, so I am very cautious on arguing that in front of anyone with any knowledge of Semitics.
Yeah, it's worth getting a consult with someone who is a Hebrew expert, and even if you're going to publish, like they might have a comment they give you for a footnote, for instance.
Yeah. I've actually also done that as well, because when I was comparing other versions of Psalm 110, I was also looking at the Syriac Peshitta version, and I had already had friends with someone who's actually an expert in Syriac. So he could tell me, here's the possible valences of that term, so my interpretation is plausible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I could guarantee that I'm not completely crazy, just mostly.
I will say that I do know a guy that is pretty fluent in Hebrew. So if you ever want someone to look it over, I can I don't know, try to convince him to look him over. I guess. I mean, that's just Dr. Josh Bowen. That's the only. That's the only guy.
Oh yeah. Right.
Well, you mentioned that. I should also mention, like earlier, it was a couple months ago on MythVision. Kip Davis, Josh Bowen, and I all basically got together to hammer on someone trying to argue that the Bible doesn't think the Earth is flat, and So I was the astronomer in that group, so I could talk about, one, they knew better at the time. 2, they pretended not to anyways, and 3, when they tried reconciling it with scientific knowledge, like in medieval writers, they basically tried to have the flattest round Earth they could possibly have.
Yeah.
I mean, it's true that they believed the Earth was round, but effectively flat, because there's only like one part that sticks above the even larger giant sphere of water that the Earth is in.
Right.
So it's like the best way they could figure out how to reconcile everything. So like I say, the flattest round Earth they could find. And also, strangely enough, there were literally people denying that anyone in antiquity thought the Earth was round, or doubted the Earth was flat. And I was like, no. No, here are all these groups that are absolutely explicit. So I also had to bring up, because in China, they were flat earthers until the 17th century. Like demonstrably so, and they even had their own version of Eratosthenes, who did his own geometric work to show what's the height to the sun, based on a flat Earth model. And No, they really literally believe this until Jesuits came over and said, "Hey, we're better astronomers, and also this is the shape of the Earth."
Yeah. In my book, The Scientist and the Early Roman Empire, I have a little section on this where Pliny the Elder talks about people who thought the Earth was flat. Lactantius has a whole rant against scientists claiming it's round.
Yeah.
So yeah, there definitely were people, even literate people, who believed it, but most educated people in the Greco-Roman era did not think the Earth was flat.
Yep.
But I do say most and literate. So
Yeah.
once you admit that most also allows for some who aren't doing that, and then there's a mass quantity of people who aren't literate. So there's definitely a lot of flat earthing going on in antiquity.
Yeah, and even where they do believe the round Earth, they still have an extremely wrong model of the Earth to try to somehow make things consistent. Like, it's been argued that Augustus was a flat earther, but those arguments don't really stand up very well. But nonetheless, he had a model of the Earth where it was basically impossible to circumnavigate, let alone find another continent of people. The argument about the antipodes, that was something that Augustine railed against.
Right. Yeah, there can't be people, can't be upside down people. That's not possible.
I do want to say that I really appreciate both Dr. Carrier and Dr. Adair for coming on, having a great discussion today over a lot of great topics. If anybody wants to subscribe to Aaron, I've got his YouTube channel linked down below in the description, as well as Dr. Carrier's blog posts that are very relevant to the main part of the discussion, which was common mistakes or how to have better conversations over all of this and everything like that. If you want to get all of those things, definitely it's in the description. We do have a few super chats to go over before we head out, so if y'all are okay with covering those real quick, we can hit those up. We got Jake Nelson, who says, "This is the least debatey debate I've ever seen. This is a very civil discussion. Thank you, gentlemen."
I'm sorry, let me change that. You stupid prick. Now.
Right.
I do have to say that these are the kind of the discussions that I especially want to host here on the channel, but also that I think that we need to be having, in a very much larger context of, the discussions that we've been having. So I really appreciate y'all coming on and being really good examples of that. Thank you so much. And then we've got Rainbow Krampus, who says, "Good talk. I think I've seen more of Adair today than his family has. Thanks for bringing some level-headedness to this topic that nobody should ever be mad about." I agree. I don't know why people get so up in arms about this topic. It's crazy.
Yeah.
And then next we've got Exum Music, who says, "Where does Carrier put an earthly mythical Jesus in probability compared to a historical Jesus or your own heavenly mythical Jesus?"
So to give an example of what I think they mean, it's possible to do a mythicist, take the Doherty thesis, which is what I build on in my book on the historicity of Jesus. It's possible to do that and imagine that they thought Jesus was crucified in the Garden of Eden, like somewhere across the Euphrates or something, where they weren't there themselves, but it happened on Earth. So that's entirely compatible. I just think the balance of evidence suggests that it's the other way around, that they think it's in the celestial sphere that this is happening. But it is possible for them to think that too, that this whole drama took place somewhere on Earth and we just weren't there. It's somewhere. The lost Garden of Eden is where it happened, right? Or something like that, right? Like that is a plausible model. I just don't see the evidence backing it. There is evidence for the celestial view. There isn't evidence for the earthly view. The other version of the historical mythical Jesus is that the apostles go around claiming that they saw Jesus get crucified in Jerusalem, right? Like they're right out of the gate, they're claiming that there was this guy who taught in Galilee, like literally just last week. Did you miss that? Like that kind of thing. I don't think that has any probability at all. I think the way Paul argues and talks and the way ancient rhetoric would work would make it impossible to sell that, and it would make it impossible for the letters of Paul to look like they do. If that's what was going on. So I don't think that bears any, and I do talk about that. It's one of the rejected models of mythicism that I discuss in chapter 3 of On the Historicity of Jesus, I assign it a vanishingly small probability. It's so small that it doesn't even show up in our rounding error in our math. So,
yeah. If I were to try to even be a devil's advocate for that, I could try to imagine, well, what if the actual historical Jesus is the one from the Talmud? So Jesus dies around 70, and Paul we've actually misdated because he was actually talking about a different Aretas that would also put his writing about a century back.
yeah.
And basically we have all this development basically before we have historical records. So there was a guy, and then many, many decades went beyond that, and the only actual memories of that is in Talmudic stuff. But
Yeah,
boy,
that's
oh boy,
way
that's strained.
Yeah, but I still think that's more probable than the one I was just talking about.
Yeah.
Like I like waffle. I sometimes wonder, like, is that, how plausible is that, right? I think it's more plausible than people give it credit. However, in my book, I would assign that as a result of historicity, that we're just mistaken about the period in which he lived, which is just the flip side of what historicists already argue, right? Like they assume Jesus was actually killed by Pilate, and that the historical Jesus in the Talmud is a made-up one. But you could just reverse the order and you still have a historical Jesus. Now it's just the Gospels that are changing the context in which he lived. And the actual story goes back to the Talmud. That's still a historical Jesus theory that would refute the Jesus myth hypothesis, in my view.
Yeah.
But I do think that it is, like, I wouldn't be outraged if scholars started taking the 70s BC Jesus seriously and started producing peer-reviewed literature arguing about it, because I'm not totally convinced it's false. I just think the balance of evidence, the preponderance of evidence is the other way around. So like a Pilate Jesus is the more plausible historical Jesus in the long run. But yeah, so anyway, that's my take on that.
Yeah. And I'll just quickly note as well that I'm not so attached to mythicism that, if the evidence is, comes up or I'm persuaded by the arguments, I'll flip, no problem. And my hope is the things that I see as problems in historicity, if they can be resolved by other historicity people, that is awesome, and that's an advancement for the field. Like, if someone could come up with a good historical Jesus model that also explains the Talmudic Jesus a century earlier, if they can explain, like, what happened based on evidence of how this story could have happened, that would actually push the field forward, and I would be happier for it.
Yeah, exactly. And I say the same thing at the end of my book, where I'm saying, like, if you can refute this, like actually produce a stable, defensible historical Jesus model, that's an advancement. Where because now we're like in this chaos of, like, everybody's got a historical Jesus. Is he a soldier? Is he is he a armed rebel? Is he is he this? Is he that? Like, what did he really say? What did he not? But if we could actually, like, narrow it down to something that was actually defensible, to actually beat the probability of mythicism, that would be progress. And so if you're able to, like, interact with and explain away the evidence that I present in my book, explain away is the wrong word, but explain it with a good model, that's better than where we were, because that evidence is sitting there not explained by current Jesus historicity models. So proving historicity could be done in a way that would actually advance the field based on the stuff we've done in mythicism. And the biggest example of this is methodology, if nothing else. If they could just reform their methodology based on what we've shown to be problematic about that methodology, that's an advance. That would be progress. So mythicism would still be useful, even if it ends up being false.
Yeah, and I definitely want to echo, like, just advancement of the topic in general, whether that's mythicism or historicism is kind of what I care about too. And it's just that I find the mythicist argument more convincing than the historicist argument. So in case anybody cares where I'm at on it, I mean, I don't have a PhD or nothing, so I feel like my opinion is worth about that much. All right, now next super chat is Jake Nelson asking, I have this hypothesis that the gospel story is an allegory about the reconciliation between God, Yohanan, and the accuser, Samael, being that John the Baptist represents God and Jesus is Samael. Thoughts?
I don't see the plausibility of that, no.
Yeah, especially if you go to Revelation, there is no reconciliation with Samael, not in the least. Same thing as if you're in the Ascension of Isaiah, that this is the enemy to be conquered, not the person to break bread with.
Yeah, and that's all over Paul too. Like, that's,
yeah.
there is one kernel here that I can like throw some light on, which is that I do think, and this even from Paul on, but maybe also to some extent in the Gospels, I don't know, but certainly in Paul, certainly if you look at Philippians 2, the hymn of Philippians 2, you look at it, it's actually a reversal of the story of Satan. So Jesus is undoing what Satan did. Satan tried to make himself equal to God, got cast down, and caused all the problems in the world. And Jesus does the exact opposite of Satan and fixes everything that Satan fucked up. So the Jesus story is a reversal. In order to undo what Satan did, Jesus has to do the opposite of Satan. So that I think is true, and you could think of that but it's not Satan who's undoing his own work. It's Jesus who's coming along to undo Satan's work. And so it is a similar concept where you could take some of the ideas of this theory and put it into the one I was describing, and it might work.
Yeah, and this makes me think about the Matthew story and how that there's that literary device of mirror, I guess, reversal, because you have Moses flees Egypt or flees from Egypt and then comes back to Egypt, and then Jesus kind of does the exact same opposite thing in sort of a mirror fashion. So I feel like the literary device being used multiple times is...
Well, this is, other scholars have noted that the temptation scene is a reversal of the failures of the Jews in the Exodus narrative, where the specific temptations Jesus gives him are the same ones that the Jews kind of struggled with in the Exodus that resulted in them being stuck in the wilderness longer than they should have been. But Jesus does the opposite. So he and he even crosses the Jordan to do it. And so this is kind of like the opposite. He's undoing the failures of Israel by fixing the Exodus. He's going to do what they did correctly. He's going to do it correctly, but they did it wrong. But anyways, I'm not the only one who's suggested this. There's other scholars who suggest that the temptation scene is a reversal of the Exodus failures to fix Israel, basically. So this is kind of like, this kind of reversal to undo things is definitely a theme that we see in Christianity.
I'm kind of curious. Is there and I haven't looked at this. That's why I'm asking this question right now. Is there a connection between Jesus being the what is he called? Like the he's referred to as like the water of life or something like that. But the main reason why Moses wasn't allowed into the Holy Land is because he smashed the rock with his rod to produce the water. I don't know. I get off on tangents sometimes.
Yeah.
Never mind.
Well, Paul outright says that was Jesus. The rock itself that was pouring water and nourishing the Jews was basically, okay. It was the pre-existent Jesus in some previous form, basically.
In rock form?
In rock form, yeah. Well, this rock is called Miriam's Well, and it supposedly floated around with the Jews, right? So there are a lot of really weird stories. If you go looking at the Jewish Apocrypha, the Exodus story is really weird. And I did a show with Robert Price long ago for Wired magazine on their podcast, where we did the what's his name? They did the Noah story. There was a movie with
the Aronofsky
Crowe, Russell Crowe, was it Russell Crowe?
Russell Crowe was the actor. I'm forgetting. I thought it was Aronofsky did the directing.
Yeah, Darren Aronofsky.
Right. It's a weird ass movie. People were like, "What the hell is going on in this movie?" And Price and I went in and actually with the host of the Wired magazine podcast went over actually they're getting stuff from actual Jewish Apocrypha. They're actually taking seriously as if all the Apocrypha were true, not just what's in Exodus that we have in the Bible, but all the Apocrypha. What would the story look like then? And they're like, oh, well, okay, then, yeah, they're throwing all this weird stuff in because that's what they were doing. The fan fiction, Jewish fan fiction on the Bible had all kinds of weird ass stuff. So, so definitely ancient religion is weirder than you're told, basically. And you can't understand it until you really understand the weirdness, I think.
Yeah. Final two super chats here. Vesper says, does the morning star double for the sun or not?
Generally not. That usually the morning star is distinguished from that you'd see the morning star before the rising of the sun. I've sometimes, I think I've seen a text where it looks like in context it's referring to the sun because it's a star and that it's bright and that it's coming up in the morning, but more often than not, it's a particular viewing of the planet Venus. Mm-hmm. Also, to make things all the more confusing, is that for the longest time, the Greeks and the Romans didn't know that the morning star and the evening star were the same object. They had different names and different designations. And I guess the Babylonians eventually told them, it's like, hey, guys, it's the same thing. Because like it only like in the days of Plato did they actually start calling that planet Aphrodite or Venus. So eventually they somehow learned that something that the Sumerians had known for thousands of years, that these were both the same object, which I've often we're talking great things about the astronomy or the science of the Greeks, and it's like on the other hand, basic observational things they failed on, which I would love an explanation for. I don't know if it's climatic or what.
Yeah, I think I don't know what passages from Philo you're working with, Aaron, but I know he talks about like the true sun that's so bright that no one can see it except through the eye of faith or something like that. So like there's like that our sun is kind of like the imperfect reflection of this true great sun, which I think he links to the Logos and hence to our archangel that we were talking about at the beginning.
Yeah. So there's actually there's one place where he talks about there's a star above the heavens that all the light of all the other stars actually derive their light from. But there's also a passage in On Giants where it talks about how much greater God is than any other divine conception, and the grammar that it says like this, and it talks about the rays of, and there's two different translations. There's the Loeb translation, and then there's the Young translation. The Young translation says that this light is the rays of the light-bearing God, and the Loeb translation is these are the rays of the divine day star, because they're both because like phosphoro and theo, they're both in genitive. It's hard to know which is modifying which.
Right.
It's ambiguous.
Yeah.
So it's only from context can I even try to argue one versus the other.
Wow. Okay. Yeah.
Details.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then finally, we've got Tang, who says, hashtag Jesus is a myth. Thanks for a great conversation. Thank you so much there, Oz, for that super chat. And that's all that we got for tonight. But I really do appreciate both of our guests, Dr. Richard Carrier and Dr. Aaron Adair, for having this discussion tonight. I think that we covered a lot of great topics and we discussed a lot of things. So, I know Carrier will be back on sometime soon, but Aaron, I hope to have you on again as well. And I guess that we'll just let y'all sort of wrap it up, tell people where they can find you and everything like that. Dr. Adair, if you want to go first.
Yeah, I mean, I have a social media presence and a website, draaronadair.com, but it's not exactly a lively place to go, and it's extremely rare that I blog because my 9 to 5 is already plenty time absorbing, as well as the other activities I do, not the least trying to be a good husband with my wife. But yeah, I'm reachable, findable. I see someone just followed me on Twitter, so people can find me. But yeah, I am slowly trying to get stuff actually published out in the literature, and I should also mention things to plug. So one is in a couple months, I'm most likely going to be publishing my book with my editor and co-author, Jonathan M.S. Pierce. We have a book about aliens and religion. And I'm a expert on that in that I used to actually be an intern at the SETI Institute, so I did professionally hunt for aliens in a scientific fashion, not the version that you're seeing on CNN or other places, much less good. But also, then what are the theological and philosophical implications if we actually do discover them? And of course, this messes with a lot of particularly Christian theological conundrums. I point out a lot of things. On the other hand, if you're Mormon, you're totally safe.
I can vouch for the co-author too. John O'Pierce does. He does great books. Let's just say. On many subjects, and so like I'm looking forward to this one. I think with the two of you working on it, it's going to be great.
Yeah, and I need to prop up John as well because I mean, not only is he very philosophically read and minded, but he's also a much better writer than me. He has very much helped me write better in the first place. So this book is only going to be better because he forced me to be better.
Awesome.
All right. Otherwise, nope. That's all. Okay. That's all for me.
Mm-hmm. And then Rick, do you want to tell people what where they can find you and everything like that?
And all things me are at richardcarrier.info. So just richardcarrier.info. That's my website. You can get to my Twitter from there, my Facebook. you can find on that. You can search my blog for Guide to Social Media and Guide to My Books. Both those two articles are in there if you want to like know how to follow me, and depending on what your interests are, what books to start with if you're interested. I also teach online courses, so the affordable, easy courses to take if you're interested in certain different subjects in philosophy and history. So there's a link for that on my website. You can find it all on the top there with the menus. And then that's also where my blog is. And then on top of that, like we've got the Crestus app. You can find a link for that. Where John is building out improvements on that that'll come out eventually. And I think that's the stuff. So all my books, there are many now, and my blog and my social media and my teaching and all of that stuff you can find at richardcarrier.info.
Yeah, I'm currently working on a better calculator, Bayesian calculator for the app right now, and I've just had a lot of things going on, so it's been a slow development process. But I've got Richard Carrier's links in the description. I've also got Dr. Adair's links, both his Twitter and his YouTube channel. So do check out all those resources, and I guess we will talk to y'all heathens later. Don't forget to stand up and use your voice. Bye, heathens.